Well, sound like I said a bad word there. No, but hi. So I am Mr. Beat, and this is yet another live stream. I've been doing a lot of these lately, but this is part 2 of a reaction live stream to a series by Genealogist, Jarrett from Genealogist. He did an entire series on my family tree, and so we are here to watch episodes 4 through 7 tonight. I have not seen these yet. Mrs. Beat has seen them. My parents have seen them. Well, my dad hasn't seen the last 2 episodes, but I am seeing these for the first time, and I'm excited. It's also just really cool to see his process, and I know this is all about me, right? So you're getting to know me and my history, but it's also cool just to see how Jarrett does history in this kind of way. And so he's doing the history of Mr. Beat. He dug deep. He did a lot of work. I'm very thankful to Jarrett for all that he has done with this series. I'm very impressed. If you haven't subscribed to his channel, I put a link in the description. Subscribe to Genealogist, especially if you're into genealogy. I mean, he is a professional. He knows his stuff. So I have 4 videos to get through tonight, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. I'll be pausing and sharing bits of information about my life as we go. One thing that you might have noticed is the title of this video is Mr. Beat Learns That His Life is a Lie. And the reason why I put that as the title is, well, because Jarrett told me to. And like I said, I haven't seen these videos yet, but apparently my guess, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, I guess, is that some of the information that my parents and maybe my grandparents told me about my family tree were inaccurate. And so we're going to find out how inaccurate that was. The most common thing that I heard growing up was that I was somehow related to Pocahontas, that I had Powhatan heritage. And then that you could link it directly all the way back to Pocahontas, so I was always a little skeptical of that, but there is supposedly a distant relative who is a Native American, presumably Powhatan, but yeah, we're mostly going to probably hear about a lot of Germanic history, maybe a little bit of French and Russian in terms of my own heritage and family tree. But let's get right into it here. Let's see. Let's do this one. I like that one. Okay. All of you in the chat, I'll try to keep an eye on it, but generally I'm going to be watching these videos and reacting to it. Thanks for being here. If you were here for the part 1, welcome back. But if you didn't catch part 1, I've also linked it in the description here. So this is episode 5. No, sorry, episode 4. We left off on episode 3, but in episode 4, its title is Native American and Civil War Ancestors. So I think we're going to find out about the whole Pocahontas thing in this first video. But also it's cool to see which of my ancestors fought in the American Civil War and what side were they on. I'm assuming they were on the Union side, but nothing is for sure when we investigate these things, right? So let's find out.
Hello, everybody. I am Jarrett Ross, a Genealogist, and on today's vlog, we will be looking at Mr. Beat's suspected Native American ancestry and his Civil War ancestors. Now, when I spoke to Mr. Beat originally about doing all of this research for him, one of the questions I had was, what are some of the things that you'd like me to look into in your family tree? Do you want me to look into any specific ancestors, any sort of connections to certain historical events? And one of the things he mentioned was that his 4th great grandmother, Mary Galtree, was supposedly a Powhatan Indian.
Yeah, Powhatan. It's a tough one. My mom says Powhatan. So
Mr. Beat sent me a good amount of information on this branch of the family in terms of Mary Galtree's line descending down to Mr. Beat. But he had nothing else on Mary other than she was married to Louis Whitcomb. And what he sent on Lewis and Mary was the following. He sent this page which showed all of this information, and at the top we see Lewis Arden Whitcomb.
Yeah, that's stuff that was passed down from to my grandmother, actually, my grandma Roush. So you know, it doesn't even. It's kind of like just random stuff that's jotted down here.
Was married to Mary Galtry, and here it's spelled Galtry, but we'll see even in this own document, it's spelled multiple ways. They were married in Jennings County, Indiana, and lived there until 1870 when they moved to Sheridan, Iowa. He went to California, he being Lewis, during the gold rush and wrote home to the family that he had struck it rich and would be coming home, but he never made it home and was considered killed for his money. And now this is something we do want to remember for the future, but then we do see married Mary Galtry, a Powhatan Indian. Now, for anyone who is watching this and is really into genealogy or has done a lot of their own research into American families or just watched Finding Your Roots, you're probably questioning whether or not this is true.
Yes, I've always questioned whether or not that was true. Someone in the chat just said, Mr. Beat, are you related to John Cena? I think so, and then also someone else asked, am I John Cena? Well, you just have to find out. Mrs. Beat, no, I'm not going to slow this down because we have a lot to get through and I have a bedtime, okay? I'm almost 40 years old. I'm getting old, okay? I'm an old man and I need to get my beauty sleep because I have work to do, okay?
One of the biggest myths in American genealogy is the myth of a Native American ancestor. Now, this is in all sorts of American families, but usually when I hear that, it's not so specific in saying this ancestor was Native American. It's usually we always heard that there was a Native American ancestor through this branch. But of course, we want to start looking into the records and see what can we actually find. So here we are back to the family tree for Mr. Beat, and we're looking at the tree with a focal point of his great-grandmother, Mabel Irene Whitcomb. And through that family, we have her father, Joseph, tracing to her grandfather, Jesse, and then that traces to Mary Galtry and Lewis Whitcomb, who we were discussing. And in looking at them, we're going to pull up Mary's profile. We do see that there's a photo of her grave, and it's kind of interesting. It looks like there's a handshake, and I've already added it.
That's awesome. Again, this is linked, I believe, to the Find a Grave website. It's a great resource that's free. This gravestone is amazing. That's cool that they have it.
Too here, and I'm kind of giving things away because we already see their parents, Nathaniel and Elizabeth, and well, do those sound like their Native American names? No, not really. Doesn't necessarily mean they weren't, but everything keeps pointing to this is very doubtful that Mary was Native American. So going to the page on Find a Grave, here we have Mary Whitcomb's grave, and we're going to try to take a little bit of a closer look. Wow. And we can just kind of see it. It's a very, it looks like a small grave, but when we look at the Find a Grave page, there is a lot of information. We have a ton of siblings, we have a bunch of children, and then we also have her parents. And when we look at the children, we can see that Jesse Lewis Whitcomb, which is who Mr. Beat is related through, is there as well. And it looks like these were all set up really well, which they were, and they were done by this Skip. Now, I tried to get a hold of Skip, and I was unable to, but from what I found, he's really done a lot of work for this family on Find a Grave. And
good job, Skip. Hey, Skip, if you're out there, please get in touch with either myself or Jarrett.
From what I can tell as well, he's probably a cousin to Mr. Beat. So now we're back on Mary's
cousin Skip. Please get a hold of us.
Page, and looking at the page, we can see wife of Lewis Whitcomb, daughter of Nathaniel Galtry and Elizabeth Fitzgerald. So now we have her mother's maiden name, and does that sound Native American?
No.
Even less. Lewis Whitcomb went to California in search of gold and was never heard from again. So that story, we have another correlation of that story. And it seems like this is coming from Death Notice, the Chariton Democrat in Sheridan, Iowa, Friday, October 18th, 1895. And then we see Cedar Township News, Miss Mary Whitcomb died last week after a long period of suffering. But as I was looking through, I decided to click through a few family members, and I clicked on Mary's brother.
I mean, we all die, but I mean the fact that she suffered. Oh, look at this. Pictures.
Jacob Fitzgerald Galtry. And he was quite intriguing. Now, just pulling up his page, we instantly see this photo, which looks like a Civil War photo. We see his grave. We see a photo of him when he was older. And there's a very, very long obituary, which also came from the Chariton Leader. and it goes into his ancestry, and we get a good look at the beginning of the family. Jacob F. Galtrey was born 1837, Steuben County near Tyrone, New York. So we're not close to Virginia. They were coming from New York to then Indiana. He's the son of Nathaniel and Elizabeth Fitzgerald Galtrey, and was one of a family of 13 children, of whom one Miss Felina Sellers of Melrose, Iowa, is living. So then it talks about his marriage, his children, and his life, his business, as well as his enlistment in Company C of the 37th Indiana Infantry. Now, with this information, I figured, let's see what we can find on Jacob Fitzgerald Galtrey. Maybe there's a lot of information out there. So what I started with was just a regular Google search. And when I did that search, I found this InGen Web, which has the Civil War letters of Jacob Fitzgerald Galtrey.
Should have went with DuckDuckGo, but okay. But still, found this. This is amazing. Okay, so we got more of the same type of, reminiscing type of. So take this with a grain of salt, I'm assuming.
Now, this page is absolutely amazing. Now, this is I want to say a book. It might be more of a compilation. I'm not quite sure what it exactly be called, but this document is called The Civil War Letters of Jacob Fitzgerald to his wife, Emmeline.
So he wrote a lot, apparently, and they were able to preserve all of it. That's amazing.
Galtrey by Charles M. Wright, and then transcribed with permission by Sheila Kell. Now, this goes into a lot of information. This is by Charles M. Wright, who is a descendant of Jacob Fitzgerald Galtrey, and it talks about the family. It shows all sorts of pictures. So we have Jacob, his wife Emmeline. It shows them older. We saw those before. But then it also kind of gives a roadmap of who he talks about in the letters. And he talks about a lot of his family, including the ancestors of Mr. Beat. And there were actually a couple of Whitcombs who married Galtreys. And so these two families were close, and multiple members of both families served in the 37th Indiana Infantry. Now, looking at this paragraph, we can see Charles Wright describing the members of the Whitcomb-Galtrey connections that are spoken about in the letters. So the Lucinda Whitcomb mentioned many times in Jacob's letters was the daughter of Israel Whitcomb and Sarah Sally Galtrey. Sally was a sister of Nathaniel Galtrey, who was Jacob's father. So Sally would be an aunt to Mary Galtrey. Then it goes on to say Lucinda Whitcomb and Jacob Fitzgerald Galtrey were first cousins. The Rachel sometimes mentioned with Lucinda in Jacob's letters were probably Rachel Whitcomb, Lucinda's younger sister. Lucinda was born in 1834, Rachel in 1842. They had a brother, Lewis J. Whitcomb, born in 1830, who died in the war at Nashville, Tennessee on August 1st, 1864. This Lewis J. Whitcomb should not be confused with the Lewis Whitcomb, husband of Mary Galtrey Whitcomb, 1817 to 1895, who was Jacob F. Galtrey's older sister, as well as Mr. Beat's fourth great-grandmother. The Lyman Whitcomb mentioned in Jacob's letters was a son of Lewis and Mary Galtrey Whitcomb. So this is a brother to Mr. Beat's ancestor, Jesse Whitcomb. And then they also mentioned that Lucretia, no last name, mentioned in his letters was probably Lucretia Whitcomb, Lyman's sister. They were both cousins of Jacob F. Galtrey. Lucretia was born in 1840 and Lyman in 1842. Lyman also served in the Civil War. Lucretia married in Jennings County, Indiana, to Joel Jackson. Now, I don't want to read too much off this website because, as we can see, I'm just going to kind of scroll down. There is a lot going through, but it includes a ton of the letters, including, and scrolling back up, including a list. So there are 60 letters in the
just imagine the work that future genealogists are going to have to do, by the way, like
in the collection, and it gives you an idea of where he went. But knowing the 37th Indiana Infantry, we can also look at the history of the infantry of that regiment and see where were they, what battles they fought in, and then know exactly where he was. But one other thing that was supplied was this amazing piece. Elizabeth Fitzgerald Galtrey. Now, this is Mary Galtrey's mother. So this is Mr. Beat's fifth great-grandmother.
Wow.
Born in 1798 in Pennsylvania. And the family tradition described her as Scotch-Irish and a Methodist who was orphaned at an early age. No record of her ancestry has been found. Now, there was something in the family tree on Ancestry where people had come up with family names for her parents, but I have not been able to confirm whether or not those are true. Now, one of the biggest things when it comes to genealogy is
maybe that's where some Native American or Powhatan heritage comes from, huh?
Is collaboration. And when you find amazing things like this, one of the best things that you can do is to reach out. And so that's what I did. I reached out to both Charles Wright and Sheila Kell, Charles being who wrote this document, Sheila being the one who transcribed it with his permission. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to get in touch with Charles, but I was able to get in touch with Sheila. Woo-hoo. Sheila has been doing genealogy for years and even has been the genealogist at the Jennings County Library. Now, if we remember, Mary Galtrey and Lewis Whitcomb were married in Jennings County, Indiana.
I've always been interested sort of in history.
Wow.
In high school, it was boring because it was remember the dates, remember that, there was.
That's not how I taught history in the classroom, by the way. That's
nothing interesting about it. Well, when you're looking at your own family, or to me now, anybody's family, if there's interesting stuff in there, it's almost like a way to gossip without getting in trouble. When I decided I was going to retire, I chose to move here because by then I had a clientele of people I was doing research for. And when I'd come down on the weekends, I would look up stuff for other people besides me. So once I moved here, I set up the research center here.
Now, one of the first things I asked her about was the Native American connection. Was there any connection?
She's a treasure, by the way. I can already tell you she is a treasure, the work that she's doing. But anyway, yeah, so Native American connection, and we're going to find out here.
Because I obviously didn't see it. And there seems to be some sort of indication in the family history from Mr. Beat. So what did she think?
Well, I'd say out of all my years at the library, 80% of people that came in thought they had some kind of Native American heritage. Of that 80%, I think it was down to, I found 3 in 10 years that were verifiable as Native American ancestry. Of course, back then, the farther back you go, the less online stuff you had. So we were fishing in the dark. But very seldom have I ever seen it turn out to be true. If he was Powhatan, that was in Virginia, in the Tidewater, if I remember, which is not where his family lived. So there's even traveling involved in this one.
Now, when I asked her about the family as a whole, and especially Mary, she didn't really know a whole lot, but she did have a good amount of information on Jacob Fitzgerald Galtrey.
We do have, here is the book. It's a little hard to see there, and it's backwards, but that is the book that got me started with it back in 2009 when I put it on my website. Mostly what I've got on him was from what I read in here. He seemed to be a very devoted husband and father, because in the book or in his letters, you can tell he's trying not to say some things about the war that he could say. As Charles that wrote it put in there, he was protecting his wife. He didn't want to tell her, of all the missing limbs and horrible things that were happening. So his is more chatty, talks about who's from home, other people he's getting letters from. There's another little blurb in there on William B. Whitcomb.
No, that's not Barbara Bush.
Military member of the Whitcomb family.
Okay.
So that, I'm kind of useless other than what few things I found so far.
You are not useless.
These people, well, we have the term bunnies. They had lots of babies. So the Whitcombs and the Galtreys were large families. Jacob appears to me to have been a very nice guy. Just from reading what he was saying. It's nice to read the letters because you get some instinct about what kind of person he was. Was he worried about the family? Was it, he wasn't talking always about himself. It was more what's going on at home.
She also had somebody at the library look into things for us to see, were there any records or documents on Mr. Beat's ancestry, specifically to Mary Galtrey and Lewis Whitcomb. And in this room...
I just gotta say, this is above and beyond. This is way beyond where I thought that, as far as the research he was going to do, like when Jarrett first emailed me saying he was going to look up my ancestry, I didn't think he would go this far, where he'd have other people looking in libraries in places like what you're seeing on the screen right now. That's intimidating to me. This is cool that he
on these shelves, in these boxes, in these folders, in this envelope were 14 pages on Mr. Beat's family, which had been done up at the request of a relative of his. And these pages included family templates filled out for 4 generations of the family, as well as a little bit more that the cousin...
There's a Lydia in there. Where is it?
Included family templates filled out for...
Lydia Davis, born in 1798. Lydia is my daughter's name. Occupation, farmer. Yeah, that sounds about right.
For 4 generations of the family, as well as a little bit more that the cousin had looked into, including some of her correspondence.
I found a letter in our library. The librarian that's doing it now looked up some stuff for me. And it's just from another relative that was inquiring. Interestingly enough, she had a little different take, where we were talking Lewis Whitcomb disappeared. Went off to the gold rush. And she does say the same thing. She states he died from drinking alkali water and was buried in Colorado. And then it says Lewis and his son William both went out to Colorado. William came back after Lewis died. Now, of course, this is family lore.
Right.
But we have one Goldtree file at the library. It has notes from a past librarian where she tried to look up stuff. The files like that are everything that's asked about one family goes into a file, including any notes that the librarian wrote to herself. So we've got her note that, this is what she found, and it was pretty much zip.
But one really important thing from this is it shows how going outside of just what's online can be really important. And that was one thing that Sheila touched on a couple of times when we spoke.
We have newspapers here clear from 1859 available at the library, not online. Mm-hmm. There's very little from Jennings County online, and we have a ton at the library. But we had 50 bankers' boxes of court records that nobody'd ever looked at.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a bit of a chore, but we've got them indexed now.
That's crazy.
But there's so much of this stuff that isn't out there for people to get to online that's in these little backwoods towns. Now, our county seat only has less than 300 people in it, which is where I live. So
more information seemed to be known on the Whitcomb family as a whole. And a big part of this, especially in this area, was because Governor Eugene Whitcomb was from that area.
So again, Governor Eugene Whitcomb. So let's review on that. Eugene Whitcomb was my grandmother's cousin. No, was it Eugene Whitcomb? Governor Edgar Whitcomb. Let me pull up the Let me pull up the screen here so you can see it. So this guy was governor of Indiana, and a big reason why there's a lot of this information is because of him. So at least you saw all the Whitcombs in there, and so again. If you watch the last live stream, he was the one who lived a pretty interesting life. He was like the world's most interesting man. I think this is the right one, right? Yeah. It was in the 60s that he was governor, if I remember correctly. Secretary of State in the 60s. Yeah, 60s into the 70s. All right. So yeah, it was cool to find out that I was related to him. Let's go back to the video. Oh, now I got to share this again. I'm figuring this out. Sorry. I'm not related to Huey Long. No.
There is, I think I counted 21 files with the name Whitcomb on them in our archives at the library.
Yeah.
Everything goes into those files. It might just be a tax list or, so-and-so voted, voting poll.
Yeah, now you had mentioned in the emails, one of the reasons why the Whitcomb family kind of was a big deal was because of Edgar Whitcomb.
Oh, yes, Gov. And he lived a long life. He was also an author. And again, the Hayden area, they are working right now on preserving his home when he was a boy.
Really?
Part of his family donated the land for where the museum sits. They have little rooms. There's furniture and all this kind of stuff that have been donated. Some is from his family. There's a statue with a bust of him out in front of the museum. So, yeah, if you say Whitcomb, that's where everybody here immediately goes to him.
Now, Mr. Beat was actually aware of being related to Governor Edgar Whitcomb and had actually posted about it on Twitter at one point. And of course, being connected to the World Family Tree, I wanted to see, did he have that connection to Edgar Whitcomb where it was already known? But Edgar Whitcomb actually wasn't in the World Family Tree. So I had to build out his part of the branch. And once I was able to do that, I was able to find that he and Mr. Beat were fourth cousins twice removed. And so we see that relation is actually through Lewis. So Lewis Arden Whitcomb, who was the one that went out to the gold rush and was never heard from again, he was the brother of Jesse Whitcomb Jr., who is the second great-grandfather of Governor Edgar Whitcomb. And she got me in touch with Roger Ruddick from the Hayden Historical Museum, who sent some of the photos.
So I got the connection wrong to begin with, and I think my grandma might have got the connection wrong too. But regardless, it's pretty close connection, closer than me and Dwight Eisenhower, which was pretty close with. Which I don't remember exactly. What was I was like fifth cousins twice removed, something with Eisenhower. I forget. It's in my head somewhere. I promise.
We looked at, as well as some documents on the Whitcombs and Galtreys, including more correspondence from that cousin whose file we found at the Jennings County Library. And now that we've looked at the Civil War era within the Galtrey and Whitcomb family trees, we're going to, in the next episode, take it a couple of generations back, and we're going to look at the generations of the family during the Revolutionary War. Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. I do hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please.
All right. So the lesson from that video is that I am not related to Pocahontas, apparently. So this is going to be something that probably, surprises, I think, many of my relatives. And that was also revealing to me when, I forgot her name, but the genealogist that Jarrett was talking to from Indiana, 80% of people that think that they have Native American heritage actually don't. I guess I'm one of the 80%. So, no Powhatan, no evidence whatsoever that I have any Native American heritage at all in my family tree. But at least I'm pretty closely related to Edgar Whitcomb, who seemed like a pretty cool governor and pretty cool guy. And also, of course, Eisenhower. Those are two. All right. So we're going to go to the next video. What if I'm related to Donald Trump? We looked at that last time, and I'm not related to him very closely at all. Like, he didn't even show up. So I thought that was pretty funny. Okay. So next is episode 5. Oh, by the way, if you just joined us, Genie Vlogger is in the chat. Oh, and thank you. He put that fifth cousins four times removed is Eisenhower for me. So that's still pretty impressive, I like to think. And Genie Vlogger will be joining us for, I might have some more questions for him. And you can ask him questions as well. Thank you, History Buff 12. Yes, thank you for getting me into history and following my TikTok account. Well, thank you for the super chat, and gladly I try to follow people if I'm actually on there paying attention. Sometimes I'll be honest with you. A lot of times it's my wife, Mrs. Beat, who's running my TikTok and Instagram. I'm more like interactive on Twitter because that's just me. So, if you want to get more of my attention, that's usually the way people do it. But TikTok, I'm trying to expand over there because I don't know. I'm not doing very well on TikTok. So if you are on TikTok, check me out. Oh, as long as we're promoting stuff, Jobsolete Season 2 premieres next Thursday. It's my podcast with Helen Hong about obsolete jobs. Every episode, we look at a different job that no longer exists, or if it does exist, it's really rare. So, for example, episode 1 is going to be about the Pony Express. Those Pony Express riders, that job does not exist anymore because the Pony Express doesn't exist anymore. So, but yeah, Jobsolete. Check it out. I'm even wearing the shirt underneath here because clearly this shirt goes with my gray sweatshirt. All right. Episode 5 of Mr. Beat's Family Tree by Genie Vlogger. And this is Ancestors in the American Revolution.
Hello, everybody. I am Jarrett Ross, a Genie Vlogger. And on today's vlog, we will be looking into Mr. Beat's ancestors who were alive during the American Revolution.
I'm surprised that he's even able to go back that far. I can't believe I had
On episode.
By the way, again, that's his band. Check out his band. I didn't know I had ancestors here going back to the 1700s. I didn't think you could trace a branch I thought that it would have all ended sometime in the mid 19th century. So that alone is surprising to me.
3, we briefly looked at Mary Galtrey with through lines where we saw a whole bunch of DNA matches, 49 of them, who all descend from Mary E. Galtrey and match Mr. Beat. And then in episode 4, we looked into the Galtrey family and learned a bit more about Mary, her siblings, and her parents. So we're going to start tracing up from Mary's parents, who were Nathaniel and Elizabeth, and we're going to trace them back to some of their earliest days in America. And a big part of this we went over actually in the last episode, because when we looked at the information from Jennings County Library, what Sheila had sent, it included a 14-page document which had 4 generations of the family in these different types of family sheets, tracing the family back fairly far. So using that to correlate with what was on Ancestry, I was then able to have a fairly confident tree that we can then build off of and then go through the hints to correlate, possibly do some searching, and then any researching if we need to. Now here we have the family tree where Mary Galtrey is the focal point. We see her parents, Nathaniel and Elizabeth. We see Elizabeth's parents, Patton Fitzgerald and Hannah McMarlin. But if anyone remembers from episode 4, it was mentioned that Elizabeth's parents weren't known. But I had mentioned that I found names that seemed to correlate, but I hadn't found any documentation to prove that. We're not going to go into it, but I just want to throw an aside, because even though there were people that had these names in there, if I wanted to ensure that I was confident they were truly Elizabeth's parents, I would need to do research to confirm that, get the documentation to correlate. But our focus right now is going to be on the Galtrey side. As you can see, we do have Nathaniel Galtrey here. We do also have his sister entered in along with her husband. But going back, we see that we have Paul William Galtrey and Rachel E. Moffett. And we have some pretty good hints in here. So just pulling up the hints, we can see some really interesting stuff. One being that we see Paul William Galtrey is not from Jennings, Indiana, which is where we were looking at the family in the past episode. We actually see that Paul William Galtrey was born in New Jersey. And this is likely one of the reasons why at the Jennings County Library, Sheila wasn't able to pull up a whole lot about the Galtrey family, because it's possible Paul William Galtrey was one of the few of his family to move to Jennings County, Indiana. But just scrolling through and looking at what is available, we have an 1840 census in Steuben, New York, an 1830 census in Steuben, New York, and then we see a 1793 Bernards Township Powell Galtrey in the New Jersey U.S. compiled census and census substitutes, which is an index, so there's not an actual document. So just pulling this one up to take a quick look, we can see that it's just a tax list. And since this is 1793, scrolling to the top, we see 1767 was when Paul was born. So he would have been a young man at this point. He would have been about 26 years old.
Imagine like 250 years in the future, 300 years in the future, and the only record that's left of you is a receipt of you paying your income taxes. That's a bit depressing to me.
But scrolling back down, we see that the oldest census that we can find where there's an actual image is the 1810 census. So in the 1810 census, he would have been 43. So here we have the census, and I know that not as many people are familiar with the 1810 census as they are with some of the later ones. But
that's how they used to do it, folks. Look at that. Yeah, that's pretty cool looking.
Once you get back far enough, you'll find that a lot of censuses become very basic. So here we can see Paul Galtrey, and what it's listing is it's listing the number of people that fit this certain column within the household. So I'm going to X out of this and look back at the indexing, and we see that they have it laid out. So free white persons, males under 10, there were 5 of them. Free white persons, males 10 through 15, 2 of them. 16 through 25, 1, etc. So it shows all of the people within the household. There are 8 total that are under 16 and 2 who are over 25, but there are 12 total number within the household. So this isn't as helpful genealogically, but it is very interesting to just get an idea of the family. And just like how Sheila put it, this was a large family, or as what she said, they were bunnies. So, but one thing that I always love to do is Google. And when you're getting this far back, if you have ancestors where you're getting a lot of relatives, it's possible that you have other relatives that have already done information about this family, and they may have a lot of great information. So when I did a Google search just on Paul William Galtrey and Rachel Elizabeth Moffett, I found a really cool page. So here we have the webpage Clan Moffett Genealogy Online. And this webpage is based around the Scottish clan Moffat, which presumably Rachel Elizabeth Moffett would descend from. Now, this article was written by an M.E. Van Gordon, and I was not able to get in touch with him. So this page gives a really interesting look into Paul's life. The webpage talks about how there's not a whole lot known about Paul's early years. He was born to an Oliver Galtrey and a Helena Leanna Otten. And he grew up presumably in Bridgewater Township, which is in Somerset County, New Jersey. And then he was married in 1790 to Rachel Moffat while still living in Bridgewater Township. It seems that he moved to New York State by 1800 or 1801, which we saw before in those other censuses. I believe he was in Steuben, New York. And he was actually following one of his older brothers who had already moved to New York as well. By the time they moved to New York, Paul and Rachel already had 7 children, one who died in infancy, but they would eventually have 14
I
children.
believe that's out by the Finger Lakes, right? Like out further out. So they traveled a bit to get out there.
Children total. While in New York, Paul Galtrey manufactured looms, farming mills, and other articles, and it's said that he lived in a log house. He's apparently very worried that anyone would find out secrets of his work, so he actually had certain things encoded, kept things secret, and even his family members seemed to be forbidden from his workshop. His family stayed in New York.
Why was it secret though? That's weird. He was guarded the secret of weaving riddles for his mills. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Huh.
Workshop. His family stayed in New York, although they moved around a bit within New York until 1829 when they made their way west to Jennings County, Indiana. And it's said that they made their way to Jennings County in a covered wagon that was being led by oxen.
Okay, let me see where they
said
started.
That they made their way 1829 when they made their way
that is okay. So they were wow, that's a bit of a journey, yeah.
West to Jennings County, Indiana. And it's said that they made their way to Jennings County in a covered wagon that was being led by oxen. For Rachel Moffat, unfortunately, her ancestry is much harder to trace as well. This is a similar story to what we saw with Elizabeth Fitzgerald. The publications about her seem to indicate that there are no parents that can be confidently named for Rachel, although there are some presumed parents. One theory is that Rachel is the daughter of Captain William Moffat and Sarah Campbell. So if this is true, that means that Captain William Moffat would be one of Mr. Beat's revolutionary ancestors, or what's often called a patriot ancestor. Captain Moffat had served in the 1st Battalion of the New Jersey Militia during the Revolutionary War, but it'll take more research to be able to confirm that he is an actual ancestor. Now, going back to the family tree on Ancestry, we're going to start looking at Oliver Galtrey II. And we're going to see where a lot of the information on this family comes from for these older generations. And we're going to see that it comes from a Bible, which was actually passed down through multiple generations. So here we have an entry on Ancestry that was done on July 19th, 2017 by Ramirez 2542. And it's a transcription by...
Shout out to Ramirez 2542. Represent. So this is it's a transcription that he provided from a Bible passed down in the family.
Dorothy Stratford, who's the corresponding secretary of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey. And then this also mentions the Hunterdon County Historical Society of Fleming, New Jersey. This copy, along with a transcription of Oliver Galtrey, the patriarch of the Galtrey family of Somerset County, New Jersey, was sent to this person by a Mr. Hubert Brown. So this is great because not only are we getting some actual context for the family Bible, we're also getting some more information that we can look into. We can look into Dorothy Stratford, who's the secretary of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey and New Brunswick. We can look into the Hunterdon County Historical Society of Fleming, New Jersey. We can look for copies of Oliver Galtrey, the patriarch of the Galtrey family of Somerset County, New Jersey. And we can also just contact the person that posted this. But the main thing is that this gives us a lot of the information on the family and where it's coming from.
Yeah,
so we have Oliver Galtrey. It's his Bible. He was born in August of 17 something, but we do see Liddy Galtrey, who would presumably be his wife, born February 1735.
So around that same time.
And then we see they generated and begat a whole bunch of children, including a Powell Galtrey.
I generated and begat as well. I hope that someday you too will generate and begat.
Born May 24th, 1767, who is Mr. Beat's ancestor. Now, this family Bible was handed down through a whole different branch of the family.
There's another Lydia. Yeah. And John and Mary, it's funny because that's on my other side of the family.
Tree than Mr. Beat's tree, which we can see because it then follows the children of Oliver Galtrey Jr., which makes sense because if we look, Oliver Galtrey Jr. was the second born, but he was the firstborn son. So firstborn son makes sense he would inherit the family Bible. But this is giving great context for the information because when we click out of this and we look at what records are...
I am also the firstborn son, so I also hope to someday inherit the family Bible.
Are available. There really is not a whole lot. We do have abstract of a will, which is from 1779. And we have some different compiled census stuff, U.S. Census reconstructed records. But this is, 1790s and later. So when we look at the records, at least here, through our hints, the quick and easy stuff, there's not a whole lot. One thing that we can do, we can look at what records are available for Somerset County in New Jersey. But I'm sure many of you have noticed the dates of Oliver's birth and death, as well as his wife. And it's very apparent, including with Paul, that they were all alive during the Revolutionary War. And
but they died during the Revolutionary War. All right? Looks like they died during it.
That they were all alive during the Revolutionary War. And in 1777, it wasn't just an important year in the Revolution, it was also an extremely important year in the Galtrey family. By January 1777, the war had been raging for some time. On December 26th of 1776, there had been the Battle of Trenton after Washington had sailed over the Delaware. Yep. And then just about a week later, the Battle of Princeton took place. At this time, Oliver Galtrey's oldest son, Oliver, had joined the 1st New Jersey Regiment under Captain John Sebring, and had also served under then Colonel Frederick Frelinghuysen. Oliver possibly even fighting at the Battle of Trenton and Battle of Princeton. But after the Battle of Princeton, Washington's army made their way north to Morristown, New Jersey, and they arrived just a few days after the Battle of Princeton on January 6, 1777. But after a surprise attack by the British on April 13, 1777, which would later become known as the Battle of Bound Brook, Washington decided to move the encampment to Somerset County, home of the Galtreys, and arrived on May 28th, staying until July 2nd. And this encampment became known as the Middlebrook encampment. And part of it was on the Galtrey land. It is largely agreed upon that the first official flag of the United States was most likely unfurled for the first time at the Middlebrook encampment. So it's possible that the first official United States flag was flown on the land of Mr. Beats' Galtrey ancestors. But
all right, well, I gotta play that again. That's pretty cool. That might be the coolest thing yet, if that is actually true. The first American flag to ever flew on the land of my ancestors. That's got to be like, I gotta brag about that at every future party I'm at here. Let's hear this again. I want to just make sure that I'm hearing this correctly. Did you all hear that in the chat correctly? That's pretty cool.
States flag was flown on the land, is on the Galtrey land. It is largely agreed upon that the first official flag of the United States was most likely unfurled for the first time at the Middlebrook encampment. Wow. So it's possible that the first official United States flag was flown on the land of Mr. Beats' Galtrey ancestors. But only a month and a half after Washington's troops began their encampment on February 28, 1777, Oliver Galtrey died and left Helena, a widow, looking over the 7 children that were still at home. Now, I tried to find any information on Oliver's death, and the only thing that I could was an abstract of his will from 1779, so 2 years after his death, and it really didn't give much information. Yeah. So the cause of death is unknown. But because Helena would allow Washington's army to camp on her property, causing her depredation, she is now recognized as a patriot of the Revolution. Now, if you do find that you have a patriot ancestor just like Helena,
that's very cool. I want to see this.
Now, if you do find that you have would allow Washington's army to camp on her property, causing her.
Okay, so rank patriotic service. How about that? Yeah. And her husband probably died of smallpox, right? So it was probably some disease.
Depredation. She is now recognized as a patriot of the Revolution. Now, if you do find that you have a patriot ancestor just like Helena, what you can do is go to the DAR's website. They have a genealogy research page, and you can actually do a search for already accepted patriot ancestors. So here we have that search, and we're just going to type in Galtrey and do a search, and she is the only Galtrey. And we see it comes up, New Jersey, patriotic service, baptized February 23rd, 1735, Somerset County, New Jersey. Death date 5/29/1821 in Bridgewater Township. Then we see service source. So this is the source that they're using to prove that there was some sort of service. So if we wanted to look further into what they think is the proving factor of that Helena is a patriot ancestor, we would want to go to the New Jersey State Archives, go to the rec group, and find the legislator series, petitions, resolutions, transactions, 1700 C to 1845, box 24. And we can see service description, suffered depredation. Now, when we scroll down, we see associated applications and supplements. And we actually see those national numbers, the different associated applications and their supplements are all connected to Paul. So they are all descendants of Helena through Paul, just like Mr. Beat. So we can click on this number and it will tell us more information on that application. So whoever submitted this application, they submitted for Henry Huke and Helena Lena Otten Galtrey. We're actually going to look at a whole bunch of different ancestors of Mr. Beat who were Patriot ancestors. But before we do that, we're going to look at his genie tree to look at some of these ancestors.
So Daughters of the American Revolution, this is a resource I had no idea about. So I encourage all of you to search ancestors on this site as well, because apparently it's that easy.
So here we have the tree view. And what I've done is I went over to the settings and I set ancestors to 9 generations. And then I set it to direct ancestors only. So it's going to be a nice clean view.
There we go.
Then we're going to go and find the Galtrey family. So I know they're over this way. And so just to get an idea, we have Mary Whitcomb, then Nathaniel, his parents, Paul and Rachel. We see that we do have Captain William Moffat and Sarah Campbell connected here. We also see Patton Fitzgerald and Anna McMarlin connected. Again, whether or not those are true, we aren't sure. We would need to go through and confirm with documentation. But looking over to the left, we have some more Patriot ancestors. First, we have Richard Peck, born 1753. So going back over to the DAR website, we can look up Richard Peck. And there we go, 1753, Lyme, Connecticut. Spouse, Sarah Tennant and Elizabeth Chamberlain. So he had 2, and we look and we see, well, Richard Peck was married to Sarah Tennant.
Yep.
Sarah Tennant was Mr. Beat's ancestor. Then as we scroll over towards the right, we also see the Zickafus family. And specifically, we have Peter Zickafus.
What a great name.
Because we noticed that the generations are a little bit older here. So when we
Are there any Zickafuses watching? If you are a Zickafus, I want to hear from you. Please let me know, Zickafuses.
Go to Peter Zickafus.
It's a pretty unique name.
Zick.
Almost as unique as Beat, I guess.
There we go, Peter Zickafus.
There he is.
But you may run into this. Future applicants must prove correct service.
Oh.
Well, why? Because the proof of service that's been used, that was established to create this person as a Patriot ancestor, has been deemed not valid any longer. Now, this could be any number of things. It could be that there was an application accepted where there was some faulty documentation. There might have been some new finding which completely negated what research was there. Or it just might be that the standards they had when this applicant was accepted just aren't the same today. So if you do find this, expect to have to do a bit more work to be able to prove that ancestor as a Patriot ancestor. Now, as we go over, we see that Mr. Beat actually descends from the Zickafus family twice. And the reason for this, if we notice, is that Marshall and Susanna were actually first cousins.
Oh, boy.
They were first cousins because George Zickafus was the brother of Mary Zickafus. Okay. And once you get back to this time, it's very common to find a lot of first cousin marriages, second cousin marriages, and even sometimes you'll find uncles marrying nieces and other sort of weird things that today we find very odd. Now, all of these ancestors are through Mr. Beat's mother's side, but there was one ancestor from Mr. Beat's paternal side who is also a Patriot ancestor. Now, going back to the tree and focusing back on Mr. Beat, we're going to go up Mr. Beat's paternal line, and we're gonna scroll our way through.
There's a lot of people there
over here to the Strubles. Now, this is a very interesting line, and most of Mr. Beat's father's side seems to have some sort of German connection, except for his Irish ancestry that's hiding in there. But for everything that we've seen, it's mostly this sort of German connection. And for the Strubles, we notice that Johann Dietrich Strubel I, born 1714, lived to 1809. So when we pull him up, we get a lot of good information. And we're going to pull up his actual profile. So we see there's a stone. We see there's multiple different documents connected. There's a lot of discussions and different things going on. We have 4 different sources. So here we have sources, one family search family tree, which I don't really consider a true source. Any sort of family trees are not really a source, in my opinion.
Yeah.
At least not a very confident source. But when we look at that overview, it gives a really good look at Dietrich Strubel's life. Now, the story is that Dietrich Strubel became an indentured servant to a man who lived in Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah, look at that. That's, you know, anytime you have this much information about one of your ancestors from the 1700s, it's impressive. So I'm just kind of, indentured servant. Another New Jersey resident. Okay, well, we'll see what Jarrett has to say about Dietrich Strubel.
that man and many of the people that lived around him would then become loyalists. But Dietrich Struble was not a loyalist. He was a patriot. So once he was able to pay off his indentured servitude by working as a stonemason, he ended up moving to New Jersey. Now, I've already been in touch with the DAR and SAR chapters that would be associated with where Mr. Beat lives. So that's Daughters of the American Revolution and Sons of the American Revolution, for those who don't know. And I was able to confirm that the ancestors that Mr. Beat has are confirmed patriot ancestors, which we can basically see off the bat. And he is eligible to apply for membership. So they actually have it set up in case he does want to pursue membership, or if his mom or sister or any family members want to pursue membership, they will be able to.
I didn't know that that was even possible. Okay, then. I'm going to sign up for Daughters of the American Revolution, or Sons of the American Revolution. I don't think I'm a daughter, but I'm a son.
I'm David Allen Lambert. I'm the chief genealogist of the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, Massachusetts. Our website is AmericanAncestors.org. We're the oldest genealogical organization in America. We are 176 years old, founded in 1845. Wow. We have over 250,000 constituents around the world. We have an 8-story research center in Boston, and we are growing. We have acquired the building next door, so we're not just a .com. We have nearly 100 employees. I've been with the organization for 28 years, but that's just scratching the surface for me because I started doing genealogy when I was 7, and that would be 45 years ago. So I'm delighted to share a little bit of a fragment of Mr. Beat's history for his own family. Fast forward to my interest in the revolution. My grandmother would bring me around to the graves of where her family were buried, and I always was really intrigued by this marker. And it was an iron marker for the SAR with a flag on it. And she told me that this was where her great-great-grandfather was buried. And sure enough, this is my 4th great-grandfather who I joined, Captain Jonathan Poor. He marched on the alarm of April the 19th, 1775 with a group of men from Newbury, Massachusetts. So I decided to join the SAR. Well, I jumped in with both feet. I've now served as their curator, as well as being their state historian now for under 2 presidencies of our state. And I'm a member of the Boston chapter. You know, one of the things I think is really fun is that a lot of people go to the DAR website, but they don't know about the great website we have on the SAR. That's not to discount the great website on the DAR. So let me show you ours. So what I have here is called the Patriot Research System, or our PRS. So you can do a search on a patriot, a member, or a descendant. You can even do a biography search if one is there, or even a cemetery search. So in Mr. Beat's ancestry, you had mentioned a couple of possible ancestors that he had who served in the revolution. Want to try to look for one?
Yeah, let's do that. So another database. In our video, we discuss Johann Dietrich Struble.
Okay.
So let's see if we can find him.
All right. I'm going to take a gander here that Struble is spelled in this way. You can have an E in front of it as well. You can also do the sounds like, which is what I've got. So let's see how many Strubles we have. We've got a Johannes Dietrich Struble in New Jersey, patriotic service, born in 1714. Does that sound like your man?
Yep. That sounds like him.
Okay. So what you can do here is you can hover over, and this is all free, just like the DAR website. So you can hover over the Patriot number here, and that pulls up a bit of a breakdown. And it says this comes from numerous sources, and it's part of the application of 2 people that joined within the past 10 years. So in fact, one of them joined just 2 years ago. 2019 and 2014. So unlike a lot of the old applications, sometimes you'll find old SAR applications on Ancestry. Someone may have filled out and say 1940.
Yeah, I think I said this during the first live stream, but the Struble side, they've been very good about keeping records. There's a lot of good records with all the Strubles. So
14, it's going to need to be reworked because a lot of times it was just word of mouth, or well, they just put it down and say, well, my grandfather was the veteran, so of course I can join, right? So they didn't ask for proofs. Well, now we ask for proofs: birth, marriage, and death for every generation, going all the way down to you, back to the actual Patriot service candidate or someone who was a soldier. So in this case, we know that he was born in looks like Germany, 1714, and then it looks like he lived to be maybe just shy of 100 years old when he died in Union, Pennsylvania. Well, it looks like we've got the right person. And why he has patriotic service, which is a little different. So with the SAR and the DAR, you can join under patriotic service, something that you did that contributed to the cause of the American Revolution. Right. So that case, he actually signed an oath. And he was also a member of the Council of Safety. Or actually the Committee of Safety. And what he did there is they were very concerned with what was going on in the war, and raising money, looking for supplies, etc., and were overall considered patriotic for their cause. I mean, obviously in 1714, it's a little older to be shouldering a musket and marching 100 miles. So I think that he did a fair share for that. So if you go here, you can actually click on the actual application It gives you sort of the data from it. And then you can purchase it if you want, and we charge $10 for the application.
So he was a member of the committee of a committee of safety. I've heard of these, of course. They were like the secret government that took control of the colonies during the Revolutionary War. So wow, that's a pretty important role that he played. So very cool. Yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed by all this.
I think it's pretty fair. You get the original, and if you tie into one of the later ones, chances are all of that hard work you need to do might parallel your own line, and you only have to get the more recent applications and maybe compare notes. Yeah, it's great. SAR is a great organization, and I've been, like I say, just been a member for a few years, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
But one really interesting thing about Dietrich, and going back to the family tree, we see with his father Andreas Struble, Andreas actually had a sister, and that sister would end up marrying a man by the name of Eisenhower. And for anybody who remembers episode 3, Struble is the family through which Mr. Beat is related to Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it is through this aunt of Johann Dietrich Struble, or Andreas Struble's sister. And I was actually able to find an extremely interesting page that was digitized from a book about the family. So here we have the digitized pages 452 and 453 from the Eisenhower genealogy, a postscript by Hans F. Friedrichs. The man who would marry Andreas Struble's sister was Hans Nicholas Eisenhower, and he settled in northwest area of Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, in what was known as...
Okay, so look at this. On the very same day on which Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated as president of the United States, but 200 years earlier, on the 20th of January, 1753, a survey was made of the land on which his great-great-great-grandfather, Hans Nicholas Eisenhower, spelled it that way, was to settle. And it was in Fredericksburg, or northwest of Fredericksburg, Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. Wow, okay. This is interesting.
Bithell Township, then in Lancaster County. It's actually noted in the Pennsylvania Gazette that on August 12, 1756, it was reported that Indians had burned the log house of Nicholas Eisenhower. Now, before Eisenhower had immigrated to America, the Struble family had immigrated first. Andreas's brother Friedrich had landed in Philadelphia back in 1731, and later he would then go to Hessen to find a wife. And it was at this wedding, which was on April 18, 1741, in Newnheim.
Wow, this is my connection to Eisenhower. This is so crazy. We're looking at my connection to Eisenhower right here. It's like more than just looking at a tree. Or wow, we have documents. Quite a bit more solid evidence here. This is crazy.
Across the Neckar from Heidelberg, that Hans Nicholas Eisenhower, who was a husband of Anna Margaretha Struble, which is Friedrich's sister, was in attendance. Friedrich gave such an enthusiastic account of Pennsylvania that Hans Nicholas Eisenhower decided to follow the Strubles to Pennsylvania. So had it not been for Friedrich Struble, Mr. Beat's great uncle, the Eisenhowers, specifically Hans Nicholas Eisenhower, would not have come to the U.S. Now that's it for, for today's episode. But on next week's episode, we're going to start looking into some family tree lines of Mr. Beat that trace a little deeper into American history.
Okay, so far what we've learned. A, I'm not related to Pocahontas. B, I have Civil War ancestors that Civil War veteran ancestors who actually fought on the Union side in Indiana. These are all related to the Whitcombs. And again, we found out more information about my distant ancestor, Governor Edgar Whitcomb, former governor of Indiana in the late 60s, early 70s. What else we've learned is I had patriots in my ancestry. I never knew that. I had at least 2 ancestors who got recognized for service for the patriot cause during the Revolutionary War. And then that last part there, we actually found more information on the connection between Dwight Eisenhower and myself. Has nothing to do with Kansas, although our families ended up in Kansas later on. Is, you know, one of those things. But that's what we've learned so far. We have 2 more episodes to go. If you're just joining me, we've been going through my family tree. I've been reacting to Genie Vlogger's series where he dug deep into my family tree. I've never seen this stuff. This is all new information to me. I'm not a genealogist, of course. It's not really that much of a hobby of mine. I haven't really ever looked into it. So this is all, you are seeing this at the same time as me. And a reminder, Genie Vlogger, I think it's somewhere in the chat. He'll be around after I react to these. So stick around for that. Subscribe to his channel. Oh, I gotta share this again. Okay, episode 6 is, he says he goes even deeper. I don't even know how that's possible. Ancestry in the American colonies. Okay.
Hello, everybody. I am Jarrett Ross, a Genie Vlogger, and on today's vlog, I will be looking into Mr. Beat's colonial ancestors.
I didn't even know I had colonial ancestors. I just thought that they all came over after.
Now, in this episode, we're going to quickly bring it forward in time again, back to that couple, Lewis Arden Whitcomb and Mary Galtrey, who we spoke about in episode 4. But instead of tracing up the Galtrey line, we're going to start tracing up the Whitcomb line.
And remember, Mary Galtrey was supposed to be she was supposed to be the one that was Powhatan, you know, like 100%. And that was my connection to Pocahontas. Nope, not the case.
So here we have the family tree where Lewis Whitcomb is the focal point of the tree. Now you can see that I've already built out a good amount, but our focus is going to be on the lineage tracing back, which I did focus on confirming. So as usual, the best place to start are the hints. So we're going to go to the hints for Lewis Whitcomb, and we already saw that there is a photo, and the photo is of the marriage license. So we're actually going to click on that and take a look. And here we have the marriage license for Lewis Whitcomb in Jennings County, Indiana. Now Lewis's name is right here, but we notice it says Lewis Whitcomb,
such good handwriting,
and then there's a huge blank.
Oh,
and presumably this is where we should see Mary Galtrey. We've already spent time looking into that Galtrey family, so it's surprising not to see Mary Galtrey listed. But I also noticed that this seems to be just a cropped image of a full digitized page. So the question then becomes, can we find that page? Because I also don't notice any signatures. Sometimes we will find the signatures of the couple. So could Mary be signing or even just making her mark? And then the other thing we can do is look at the other marriages around that time and see, do they also have the bride missing? Or is there maybe something a bit more nuanced that we're not quite getting? So I'm just exiting out.
I don't understand why they would have the bride missing on the marriage license. What the heck? This is fishy to me.
And we're going to look and see, do we have the marriage license through Ancestry? If we can find that marriage license through Ancestry and take a look at it, we can get that idea. Now, we do have information. We see here Indiana U.S. marriages, but this seems to just be an index. But you can see view record page for additional details, certificate purchase, suggested records, or to report an issue. So when we click that, it takes us to this page, and we can also click source to see a bit more of the source information. And if we notice, it says original data, Indiana marriages, 1810 to 2001, through Family Search from Salt Lake City. So let's jump over to Family Search to look further. So here at Family Search, this is the new search database. For anyone who's used Family Search for years and you're looking at this, you may be a little confused. This was just recently rolled out, although I think there are some people.
So if you've used this website, Family Search, let me know in the chat. I'm curious. I'm kind of looking at it here. You might do some digging on your own right now as we go through this.
But it might not have been fully rolled out to yet, but this will be the look of Family Search going forward. So all we're going to do, we're going to hit the more options so we can get the full list, and we're going to put in Lewis Whitcomb. Now we know that the marriage was in 1839 in Jennings County, Indiana, so we can just put that as 1839, and I'm just going to leave it as Indiana. That way it's a bit more broad, and in case it wasn't exactly recorded as Jennings County, Indiana, maybe it was recorded as something else, which does happen. So we hit search, and we see, all right, we have Lewis Whitcomb, marriage date, September 30th, 1839. That's matching up. And if we look here on this one going over to the right, we have an image, so we can see the actual page.
Has the blank.
So we're going to put this down, and now here we get the full thing. So we recognize the page here. Here's Lewis Whitcomb's marriage, but we also see there are no signatures here. There's nothing seemingly here. And then down here, we have a different marriage, and we do notice that both the bride and the groom are listed.
Okay.
So it's something that we should expect. But we also notice that under this, there's this state of Indiana, Jennings County, this to certify that I did on the 2nd day of September 1839, joined together in a state of matrimony, the husband and wife, which looks like Cole Eastman.
So this is before even the typewriter, okay? This is an official marriage license, and look how it's written out. I just want you to really think about that, because it's not that long ago. It's less than 200 years ago where we have marriage licenses like this. It's just amazing.
And Elena M. Walton, given under my, and I'm not quite sure what it says there, November 9th, 1839. So we can look over and we see we have a whole nother one here, both of this county, October 17th, 1839. It's got that part underneath the main passage. And we see that here too. This is to certify, but that is not here. So what does this actually mean?
Okay, what does it mean? Before we get to that, thank you for the super chat. MYR, James Madison and Zachary Taylor were second cousins. I didn't know that. I did not know that.
And this is a very interesting thing to do when you find records. A lot of people probably would have seen that record on Ancestry, clicked on it and thought, oh, this is so cool, record of marriage from 1839, not really thought anything of it. But when you dive into it and look into it and you see the bride's missing, there is no certification underneath, which the other marriages all seem to have. So something is going on here. So did they actually get married on September 30th, 1839? Did something happen and they didn't get married? Another thing to note is that not only is Mary Galtry's name missing, but it looks like they left a space to write it in. Sometimes you will find records where there are issues with the actual documentation. Maybe the ink has leaked. Maybe it's not as legible. But with this, it doesn't look like anything was written, and we can even see the writing from the other side of the page just faintly. Especially noted that whoever wrote these wrote in a somewhat italic way, so everything is going from the bottom left to the top right, and we notice that this is slanted from the bottom right to the top left, indicating that it would be more of something from the other page than ink that has possibly disappeared or fainted or whatever for whatever reason, especially considering that the rest of the text has not. But we do have a whole bunch of other documents that do show that Lewis Whitcomb was married to Mary Galtry, but I think there's a question, at least for me at this point, when did Lewis and Mary actually get married? Were they ever actually married? And what is going on with that marriage certificate? So here we are back at that family tree, and we have here Jesse.
That threw me off there, okay? And he doesn't know, he doesn't understand it either there. So weird.
Whitcomb, who's the father of Lewis Whitcomb, and he was quite an interesting person. He was married to a woman named Sarah Peck, and they had a whole lot of kids, which scrolling down, we can see that there are a lot. And a lot of the information that I found on Jesse actually comes from a book that was written by one of his descendants. And we can actually see a page from that book, which was uploaded by a user who I actually was able to get in touch with. And she has sent me a whole lot of great material. But first, we're going to look here at this page, and we see Jesse Whitcomb. Now, the woman who wrote this book has since passed, but we can see her great-great-great-grandfather's story. So Jesse and Sarah are her third great-grandparents, but these are Mr. Beat's fifth great-grandparents. And it tells us Jesse Whitcomb was the son of Israel Whitcomb, born March 13th, 1733, married April 11th, 1764, died May 11th, 1811, and Mary Rowley. Jesse was born in Connecticut on April 8th, 1773. But the most interesting part to me is the story of Jesse in this. It says that Jesse took his family west sometime between 1804 and 1815. Which is right before Mr. Beat's ancestor Lewis was born in 1816. Although based on the information I had, it seemed that Lewis Whitcomb was born in New York, so it's possible that that 1804 to 1815 range might have actually been more 1816, or it's possible that the birth we have for Lewis Whitcomb is incorrect itself. Right. So there is a discrepancy there, and this is something that we always need to deal with when doing genealogy. And a big part of this comes from what's known as the genealogical proof standard. And one of the things that's in that standard is that any sorts of contradictions need...
Shouldn't this be like a standard for any kind of research, right? Reasonably exhaustive research. Like if you're going to research vaccines, you know, you need to have reasonably exhaustive research. You need to have complete and accurate source citations, analysis and correlation of the collected information, resolution of any conflicting evidence. That's corroboration. That's one of my favorite ways to figure out if something is true or not. A soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. Well, you know, that's a little overrated, but
need to have a clear resolution. And in reality, something we run into all the time are issues of contradictions where there may never be a true resolution.
I it's not just genealogy. I come across this when I research almost every video I've ever researched, every history video, like strictly history. So not my geography videos so much. I've come into an issue where there's at least one date that is conflicting with another date. And I'm just like, well, I just have to say sometime between this time and this time because I'm getting conflicting information. I don't want to. It happens all the time.
Although that's one of the reasons why DNA is so great, because it can overcome a lot of these walls we face with the lack of documentation. But back to Jesse's story.
Genealogists in the future, I take that back. You're going to have a much easier job thanks to all the DNA that you'll have in the future. But man, they going back, especially going back before the 1900s, you just didn't have much to go off of. I mean, like last episode, it was just mostly tax records or census records, and that was it. The fact that we're getting stuff like this, even if it, stories passed down, so we don't know how accurate it is, but at least it's something that's written down, even if it's later.
Made their way to the Ohio River, floated on a raft down the river until they came to the mouth of the Wabash River. They pulled their way up the Wabash to Vincennes, where they lived in a big log cabin with a bark thatched roof. They had 14 children, which seems to match that huge list that we have, which I only have 13 children listed. But that could be explained by this sentence here. One child died at the age of 2 and one at 14 years of age. So is it possible that child who died at the age of 2 isn't included in our list? So we have to look at all the children and see, do we have one who died at the age of 2? It also mentions that Jesse was a shoemaker and a carpenter. Now, if we also notice, this description says it's a page from They Came to Spencer Township, The Ancestors of Fay and Fielding Were, compiled by Alice Warr Yarnell. Now, I looked into this book, and I actually was able to get more information from C.J. Kotecki, who turned out to be the niece of Alice, and she even sent me a whole bunch of pages that had corrections from the original publication that Alice did. And this also means that C.J. is a cousin of Mr. Beat. In fact, she is Mr. Beat's 5th cousin once removed, and Alice is Mr. Beat's 4th cousin twice removed. Now, back to the tree. Here we have Jesse Whitcomb. Then we see he's the child of Reverend Israel Whitcomb and Mary Rowley, which we did see was confirmed through the book. Israel Whitcomb is the son of John Whitcomb and Meadville Dunham, which I hope I'm saying that name correctly. But then if we hit this, we'll be able to see some of the older branches as well. And we see that John Whitcomb is the son of Job Whitcomb and Hannah Loomis. And then Job Whitcomb is the son of Job Whitcomb and Mary Rowlandson. And Job Whitcomb is the son of John Whitcomb II and Francis.
I think most of my ancestors were pretty religious, even with names like Job and Israel was a reverend apparently. So
it's Cogan. And when we click on John Whitcomb and go to his profile, we see that John was actually born in Taunton, England. So he was Mr. Beat's immigrant ancestor. But looking at the dates,
going that far back, huh? Going that far back. So I at least one part of my tree of, it goes back to the 1600s being on this continent. That's crazy.
We know that he had to have been a colonist. And something of interest for anyone who remembers back to episode 3, John Whitcomb II and Francis Cogan are also the ancestors of President Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah. See that? So I always knew there was some weird other reason why I liked Coolidge so much and Eisenhower so much.
Although I should say an aside that I did not spend the time to confirm the line tracing from Calvin Coolidge to John Whitcomb and Francis Cogan. But I was able to reach out to some of my genealogy friends, and I got in touch with David Lambert, who found a lot of information.
I'm David Allen Lambert. I'm the chief genealogist for the New England Historic Genealogical Society in Boston, Massachusetts. Our website is AmericanAncestors.org. We're the oldest genealogical organization in America.
Yes.
If you're ever in Boston, Jared, you have to come in and see our library, but you can also visit it sort of virtually because we have a digital
most people were really religious back then.
Archives is amazing.
And
we have a building.
Czarist mapping, that is horrible.
We have the Jewish
what
Heritage
happened
Center,
to
which is a great collection and collaboration.
Your family records. I'm so sorry that happened to you.
So American Ancestors is brought to you by the New England Historic Genealogical Society. We have a 28 million manuscript-based collection and growing. We have fine arts and an 8-story research facility, so you can physically come in as well as go to us online. It's very easy to go to. Just go to AmericanAncestors.org and learn a little bit more about us. You can tell them David Allen Lambert sent you. Right, John Whitcomb. a New
Oh,
England
look at
Great
this. I got
Migration
a
immigrant.
Google slide
Now,
presentation.
one of the things that I always find it's tough with New England research, Jared, is that a lot of times people want to know the vessel their ancestor came over on. That's great. We don't always have passenger lists, or in fact, some of them aren't even passenger lists. They're called records of embarkation. Someone has asked for permission to sail on a vessel. So it's not the type of passenger list you think about with Ellis Island coming into New York City.
Yeah.
So we have some that have those. Now we have some we're not really sure where they came from in England, other than they showed up at a port. And that makes it a little tough to try to figure out where they're from. Now, DNA has helped out a lot of that, but we're really lucky with John because about 25 years ago, a scholar unearthed some really good information about where he came from.
Wow.
So what we know is that John was born by 1598 and was the son of Thomas and Joanna Pope Whitcomb of Taunton, Somerset, England. And when he's about 25 years
Okay, so this is my ancestor who came over on a boat, crossed from England. From England? Yeah, from Weymouth, England, on May 8th, 1635. We have a specific day there that my ancestor and family, so it wasn't just him, John Whitcomb, got on a boat and headed over here. That's pretty early. That is fairly early. Like not that long after the Puritans first arrived.
Years of age, he married at St. Mary Magdalene Church, and that's in Taunton as well, to Francis Coggan.
Still there.
Now, they had a large group of children, and that included first one, Catherine, born about 1624, right through Mary, who was born in New England about 1647. And as you see there, there's two Jonathans. Well, the second Jonathan equals into the time frame when the family is now in New England. And that is a great nuclear family and typical of an early New England family that has a couple of kids. So on May 8th, 1635, John Whitcomb and his family set sail aboard the Hopewell from Weymouth, England, and they land in New England and then settled in Dorchester in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, Dorchester is just south of Boston. In fact, is actually part of Greater Boston now. It's part of the city, is a part of the whole infrastructure, which is like Dorchester, Roxbury, etc., which are the old settled towns, which are all now part of Greater Boston. John will stay in Dorchester for a little while. In fact, he gets 12 acres of land on Squantum Neck. Now, this originally, of course, was Massachusetts Indian land. And the Massachusetts Indians, who I'm actually the tribal historian for, had their, I would say their summer village on not very far from Squantum in a place called Chickatawba Hummock. So he would have known people that were the native people that lived very close by to where he lived in 1636 and got 12 acres of land. Now, by 1639, John and his family moved from Dorchester to Plymouth Colony in Situate, Massachusetts. And John obviously is one of those people who is a little fearful of the native population, as they all were back then. You weren't really sure. And in 1637, actually, the Massachusetts and Connecticut settlers fought the Pequot War. So there were a lot of militia in the early towns. And actually, John appears on the list of militia in Situate, essentially men that were able to bear arms. In fact, we find out later on in his last will and testament that he had his military arms, which were valued at a total of £1. By 1652, John was admitted as a freeman into Plymouth Colony on June the 3rd, 1652. That basically means he's free and clear of all debt, that he wasn't indebted to anyone for his indenture to come over. So he probably didn't have an indenture. He probably came over free and clear, as we would imagine, or at least by 1652. That also means he was a member of the church, and he could also serve on the jury, which happened later that year. In fact, so much so that he served on the jury and was also a constable in the town of Situate. So that means that he served warrants and brought people before magistrates. And so you could say that John may have been, in a way, a colonial police officer. By 1654, they now have settled in Lancaster, Massachusetts. So they've kind of hopscotched all around Massachusetts, going from Dorchester to Plymouth Colony, then out to Lancaster. John died intestate on the 24th of September, 1662 in Lancaster, Massachusetts. And unfortunately, having not
what does intestate mean? And intestate what? Not having made a will before he died. Okay, I never knew that. I learned something else new. That's great. I have a will. I had
a lot of the breakdown of his estate, but you still get to see the inventory. And his inventory was a pretty substantial amount, and not bad for a farmer at that. Now, on October 2nd, 1662, we can find the value of his estate because an inventory was taken. That was just a little bit longer than a week later. And his entire estate was worth at £112. Now, we know that John was literate. not because he wrote a will, but he actually signed a deed where his name is then transposed on. So we have an idea that he actually could probably write and no doubt could probably read. So much so that his wife, who died 9 years later, Frances, wrote her own will on May the 12th, 1671, and it was proved March 23rd, 1671-72. So the family itself is a really interesting group in New England, because we know where they're from in England, which is something that's not always the case. A lot of people make speculation, but to know where
that's a lot of information that he knew. Like, that's a lot. That's impressive that he knew that much.
16th century born immigrant. Was actually born based upon his parents and connections with a marriage in 1623. And I can tell you all this great information was vetted by the amazing scholar Robert Charles Anderson, who worked on the Great Migration series for many, many years, and still is actively a scholar. He's a fellow with the American Society of Genealogists, and someone I've been a basically mentor of for many, many years. So I can tell you that all of this is in good standing. This is published in The Great Migration Begins, and you find this series was published back in 1995 when NEHGS was celebrating its sesquicentennial, or 150th. And to get back into the 16th century, Mr. Beat, you're doing pretty well.
But David also had found some great records through the American Ancestors.org database and showed how to find them on the database.
Well, you know, one more thing I want to show Mr. Beat is that American Ancestors, we have digitized a lot of records over the years. And one of the things I thought he might want to see is the original records for the Whitcombs. So on American Ancestors, if I go to search and browse our databases, now the town he lived in ended up changing over to Worcester County, but at this point in time, it's under the records of Middlesex County. So if I go to the Middlesex County probate files and I put in
his name,
in 1662 to 1662, and I hit search, here's a 4-page probate record for him. Like I say, it wasn't a lot of documents. So I go to view. Let's do full screen here. And so there's the actual docket itself. And if I go to the next image, I'm going to have to pull out this and do it this way. This is the actual
look at that
detail on the court case.
Look at that handwriting.
Dying intestate. So all of these,
everything that was left behind,
kind of give us a sense of the family. But there is Francis's mark, his son John's mark, his son Jonathan, his Job,
his signature,
his daughter Mary's mark, and his daughter Abigail's mark, all making marks on this probate regarding the settlement of their dad's estate.
Their signatures,
which I think is really great, because we may not have portraits or paintings of individuals, but seeing their marks. So in this case, you basically have an FW for Francis Whitcomb, and John. Well, these squiggly lines were his mark. He may have not delivered himself. But
so like a mark is like a what? How is that different from like a signature? Is that the same? That's the same thing, right? It's just a type of signature mark, right? And correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. He's just calling it a mark.
Some of the other children are. So you have Job and Josiah, and then the girls, Abigail. Looks like she's making an A. It looks a little like an R, but it's some good documents to have
among us.
Your family kind of illustrates the past. Now we know that Frances, soon after, 9 years later, left her own probate. And if we go back to that, now Francis Whitcomb, we know wrote a will, and obviously it's been transcribed, and we have the facts from it from the Great Migration book. But sometimes these original documents get lost. Now this docket here is something that you would expect to find in a folded up 17th century document. It's from 1672. But the surprise that awaits you when you open it up is that it has these cards stating that the record of the will and the record of the inventory are recorded on volume 3, page 396 and 397. Now, this is what happens when the originals get lost. And this is why the checks and balances system of recording probates from the file papers into record books was so important. And it doesn't happen all the time where they're been mislaid, but this is a prime example. So on FamilySearch.org, you can find the record books for Middlesex County, and you could go to volume 3, page 396 and 97 and find those documents. In this case, we had John's, but somebody mislaid Francis's, but that's okay because we can find it a different way.
But that wasn't all David had for me, because he had found some quite interesting stories about John Whitcomb.
Okay.
So while you were looking into John Whitcomb, were you able to find any interesting stories about him?
Yeah, actually, there were actually a couple, and it's amazing because you think
Here
of the
we go.
17th century, there's not a lot of stories, but court records are where you find the stories. So let me put my glasses on and see what I can tell you here.
Oh,
So
what do you get in
this is
trouble
again
for?
from the work of Robert Charles Anderson. On the 3rd of March, 1639-40, for so much as John Crocker of Scituate is proved to have corrected his servant boy, Roger Glass, in a most extreme and barbarous manner, that the court upon due consideration hath taken said Roger Glass from said John Crocker and placed him with John Whitcomb of Scituate to serve out his time with said John Whitcomb, which is 6 years from the 14th of June next, and said John Whitcomb paying the said John Crocker £3, deducting 5 shillings from his charges, and the said Crocker to deliver up the clothes to the said Whitcomb. Now, this is not enslavement. This is where someone has actually taken and is giving an apprenticeship to a child. Now, obviously, the other person wasn't treating him pretty well.
Yeah.
The court stepped in and made Whitcomb his new apprentice. So he learned his trade from John Whitcomb after, well, Crocker failed.
Wow.
The interesting thing about Roger Glass, he is actually a nephew of Francis Coggan Whitcomb. So it was a family member. So it's kind of like taking in your nephew or niece. Now, there's another story. You can think John is very gracious and kind for doing this for his nephew. But on March 3rd, 1639-40, John Whitcomb complains against John Stowe, same date, same court, in an action for trespassing upon the case and the damages of £30. The jury finds for the plaintiff £5 damages and charged with the suit. Execution is for 14 shillings 6 pence. And then in 1653, Ephraim Kenton complaineth against John Whitcomb in an action on the case to the damage of 30 shillings for non-payment of money, as it appears upon the bill. The jury found the plaintiff for the bill and the charges of the court. So we have John being very generous, and then forgetting to be generous and owing a bill and brought to court, and then somebody trespassing on his land and getting a little money for that. So he's a human with a story that might be no different than, say, yourself or your neighbor if you've ever had a court case brought in.
Not too exciting there.
I hope that little bit of color helps Mr. Beat realize that even our colonial ancestors had hot tempers and warm hearts.
Now that's it for today's episode. But an interesting aside is that I get the feeling, in fact, I'm quite positive we'll be revisiting the Whitcomb family for one of our upcoming guests on a future season. But on the next episode, we're going to start looking into Mr. Beat's ancestors who came from Russia. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm in case you missed the tweet from a while back, I'm a distant cousin, apparently, of Matt from Useful Charts, we found out, thanks to the work of Jarrett. And there is one more final episode here. Thanks for sticking around, y'all. MYR again. James Monroe almost dueled Alexander Hamilton. I think I remember hearing that, but thanks for sharing that fun factoid and for your generosity as well. And Jefferson Davis. It shows up differently. MYR. Oh, that's like the currency. So no, your username is Divine. No, din. The font is all weird. Denny Hay, thank you for sharing the super chats. Jefferson Davis was Zachary Taylor's son-in-law. Yes, I knew that. I put that in one of my videos. All right, so if you're just joining me, here's what we've found out so far. I'm not related to Pocahontas. I have ancestors who fought for the Union in the Civil War. I have an ancestor, well, a distant cousin who was a governor of Indiana. I have ancestors who fought for the Patriots or served the Patriots in the Revolutionary War. And I have records directly, like a direct line on my tree, going back to a gentleman who came from England with his family. Going back all the way to the 1630s, I have ancestors who have been on this continent, at least one who was a colonist. So there's a final episode here, and then Jarrett will be joining us. I think he's been hanging around the chat as well. But this is episode 7. Volga German ancestry.
Hello, everybody. I am Jarrett Ross, a Genie vlogger, and on today's vlog, we will be looking into Mr. Beat's Volga German ancestry. Today we're going to shift our focus to Mr. Beat's great-grandmother, who was born Estella Marie Schmidt. Now, we actually started talking about this branch of the family in episode 2 because this was one of...
Now, the Volga is a prominent river that runs through Germany. I'm assuming that's what he means, that the region around the river. But yeah, like I already knew that I had a lot of ancestors from Eastern or Western Germany and Eastern France. So I'll see how, I'm curious which direction he's going to go with this video.
The branches that we found through DNA. And in episode 3, we go much further into it and actually built out some of the tree. But now we're actually going to dive into the story of the Schmidt family. Now, here we have the page that we've built for Estella Marie Schmidt. We see that she was born September 29th, 1904 in Catherine, Kansas, and passed away September 1st, 1999 in Sharon, Kansas. So I imagine Mr. Beat may have met her in his lifetime. Now, she was one of many siblings, which we can see here that we added previously when we were doing the DNA. And her parents had a lot of siblings as well, and it was a really large family. So now we're going to take a look at Estella in the tree to take a look at the family because it is so large. Now, we built out Eugene's siblings. We did not build out Mary's siblings yet. Eugene being Estella's father and Mary being Estella's mother. Now, Estella was born in Kansas, but when we look at Eugene, we see that he was actually born in Russia in a town called Katharinenstadt. So looking at his profile, let's see if we can get an idea of when he did come over to the United States.
All right. So, yeah. So my mom's side, apparently, there was more recent immigrants to the continent. So that's what I assumed also for my dad's side, but that's definitely not the case on my dad's side.
So he was born in 1875, and when we scroll down, what we find is that his first census is actually 1880.
Oh, that late.
So clicking on this, we see that he was 5, birth date 1875, born in the USSR, home Catherine, Ellis County in Kansas, dwelling number 8. We see that he's the grandson of the head of household. His father's name is John and his mother's name is Catherine. And then here we see the household. It's a very large household. But when we take a look at the actual census, notice that there's only 6 pages. And that's because Catherine is just a small town. So here we have the Schmidt family, and we see Jacob Schmidt, Maria, their son Cornelius, their son John, their daughter-in-law Catherine, which if you look, it says daughter, but then it says in-law underneath. And we know that John and Catherine are Eugene's parents. We see Eugene is 5, and he has a brother, John Jr., who's 2. And then Andreas, his wife, Emily, and then their children. But something that I have experience with in researching in my own family is a small community. And sometimes doing small community research and focusing on the community beyond just your family, in a sense, you may actually find more about your family. So looking at this 1880 census, when we actually go to the first page, we actually see, well, look, there's Carlin. And what was Eugene's wife's name? Carlin. So we see that same family name. And when we even scroll up, we see there's 2 households of Carlins. So when we zoom out, we kind of look through, we notice the names, Corner, Walter. I'm not sure what that says. I think Leeler, but then we see Bissing. We go to the next page where we have the Schmidts. We see Bissing, Schmidt, Staub, Schultz, Weitz, Leenum, Weilert, and then go to the next page. And basically just going through, you kind of see the community. We have Mice, Weilert, Ubert, Miller, Staub, Toller, Staub.
Farmer.
So we see a lot of these same family names over and over. We see a lot of these Staubs. We have more Carlins. Here we have what looks like Giebler or Gubler. We have another Schmidt family. We have another Carlin family. And there was one more thing that I found really interesting.
What he's saying basically is I'm related to pretty much all of this town.
When looking at the census. Back to this page here, when we look at who was the enumerator, we'll notice the last name Carlin. So more than likely, the person doing the enumeration for the Catherine Township was part of that family and is one of Mr. Beat's relatives. Now, because Catherine was a small town, I figured I might as well see, can I find anything about the town specifically? And boy, could I. Just by doing a little bit of Google searching and sometimes even social media searching like on Facebook or Twitter, it helped turn up all sorts of stuff for me. One thing I found was this website, volgagerman.net, which is run by the American Historical Society,
That is cool. Yeah. So little disclosure here. Jarrett did make us aware of this town that still exists in Kansas, and we were hoping to make a trip out there, but we were not able to. It's a bit of a drive from where we live in Kansas. A lot of people don't realize how big Kansas is, but this town apparently, even to this day, I have a lot of relatives there, and it still has that heritage of this part of Germany. Now, this is not Volga. This is not Western Germany. I believe this is where I'm getting some of the Russian influence here, or actually Prussian, because I think for a while, like during this time, Prussia was a country.
Of Germans from Russia, also known as the AHSGR. I also found that the Ellis County Historical Society, which Catherine is in Ellis County, had all sorts of documentation and information on the township of Catherine. Some really interesting things they actually have model houses of the entire town of Catherine, which were built by A. Schmidt. And then I found a genealogical book called The Founding Families of Catherine, Kansas. And that book's author, Sean McGinnis, actually ran a Facebook page. And here we have that page, and just scrolling down, we can see once we get to some of the names. Weilert, well, do we remember the Weilert name in the 1880 census? Bolig, I don't think I quite remember that name. But then we get down here and we see Lycum. We see that that's within the Weilert family. We see there's Carlin. We see that Goit's name. And once I found that page, I sent him a message, and we were able to soon connect.
Sean McGinnis. I born and raised in Hayes, Kansas, Volga German, half Volga German, but Volga German ethnically. Started doing genealogy with my grandmother when I was about 13. So that's about 40 years ago. So I've been doing genealogy for a while.
Now, one thing that Sean was able to explain was the story behind the Volga Germans, because I don't really know a whole lot about Volga Germans. And when I found that they were called Volga Germans, but they were from Russia, it was like, well, what are Germans doing in Russia? What's the story here?
Well, it comes from the Volga River. And so they went and settled the steeps along the Volga River. And therefore, they became known as Volga Germans. Catherine the Great, who was a German princess, decided that she wanted to settle the steppes that were uncivilized, uninhabited, and she sent out a decree. I'm thinking it's 1763, asking anyone in Europe, primarily in central, around Germany, if they wanted to come and have religious freedom, free land, and exemption from military service. As they had just come out of the 7 Years' War, and there were a lot of religious tensions, a lot of people, I think 27,000 people left. Most of them were German, although there were some French, there were some British, there were Dutch, I think there were even maybe some Swedes, but there were not, we call them Volga Germans, but they weren't all necessarily 100% German. Katharinenstadt was a large city. It's not called Markstadt. I'm not even sure what it's called now after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but it's a big city, and the Germans were only a part of it. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is they stayed German.
Marx Germany. Oh, well, there's the Deutschmark. Is that in Russia? Where is this at? I don't know. I'll have to follow up on that one, like where exactly this is at.
They stayed German, marrying very little into Russia. I don't have very few marriages into Russian families until late 19th century. There was a couple, but it was really they stayed German, they married German, and they stayed in their communities and wanted to stay that way.
But the benefits that Sean mentioned didn't last forever. And Sean explained that as these benefits of living in Russia began to dissipate, these Volga Germans started to look to move elsewhere.
Russian monarchy, started rescinding the things that they had moved there for. They were now no longer exempt from the military, and they started controlling the religious practices. They would send agents to the churches and kind of started surveying them, and they felt the change of the winds. And so many of them started leaving. Around 1870 is really the start of the big push. The Catherine people all came in about 1875, 1876. They all came at one time, and they chose Catherine because they sent a scouting party of 5 members to go to various places in America, which of course at that time was kind of doing the same thing Catherine was. Come to the Midwest. Yeah, we'll give you free land. And so they went. America was
paradise.
A country doing that. Argentina was doing that. Brazil was doing that. And so they sent out search parties. And of all the places they went to, they felt that the Ellis County area resembled the most their Volga home. They knew that. I think they knew it was coming. And of course, the truth is, I mean, it took a while, but 1941, the Russian government made them, because it was wartime and they were Germans. They made them outlaws, and they shipped them all to Siberia. So first they starved them to death, and then they shipped them all to Russia. So the winds were not in their favor, and so I think they felt it was time to get out and to refine the freedoms that they were continuing to enjoy, but were losing.
Earlier, I mentioned that I had found VolgaGerman.net, and they had a page all about Catherine. So here we have that page about Catherine, and it gives a lot of information on the town.
And in case you hadn't figured it out by now, I'm assuming that it's named after Catherine the Great. That's why they named it Catherine, although the spelling it's different from what I'm used to. But
now here we can see that it actually gives us the story. Catherine is a small community of approximately 89 to 90 residents located in north central Ellis County. The town was established on April 8th, 1876, but a group of German immigrants had moved from Katharinenstadt, Russia. These early settlers of Ellis County were part of the same group of Germans who had lived along the Volga River in Russia from 1764 to 1875. Now, jumping ahead in this explanation, we actually get a little bit about their journey. So their journey from Katharinenstadt, Russia, took them through Saratov, which is a big city near Katharinenstadt, to Berlin, Bremen, and then they sailed to Baltimore. They arrived in Topeka, Kansas on November 8th, 1875, where they spent the winter and worked. The 1st of March, they arrived in Hayes County.
By the way, Topeka is where I was born.
For about a month. They went back and forth by horse and buggy from Hayes to build their new town site and homes. This original group of settlers was made up of approximately 7 families, and in July, September, and November 1876, additional families arrived in Catherine. Now, you've been able to study this really in depth because it's such a small amount of families, and so you've kind of been able to study them, I guess, in a sense, as a community instead of just studying the family.
I did, but I didn't start out doing that. I probably did it like everybody else is. Who's my parents, and who are their parents, and who are their parents, and you find you know their name, and then you find their birth act, and then you find who their parents are, and then you look for their parents. You just do your direct branch. Well, as I was doing that in Catherine, my grandfather is a Stab, and he was born there. I did that, and then I would do like, who are the brothers and sisters too? So, but as you're doing that, then they would marry a Carline, and this one married a Carline, and that one married a Carline. Well, were they sisters? Were they cousins? what? And so it started bringing up this question. I kept coming across all of them, and kind of realized that there weren't so many. I just decided to do all of it. And when I did all of it, then I could kind of see how all the pieces fit, and at how the families were intermarrying, and then if somebody married somebody, was that really their sister? Well, yes, it was their sister, because here's her birth record, and here's her parents, etc. It actually made it way more easy to understand from my family point of view. I could figure out exactly how they fit into their community, and the fact that Catherine is a bit unusual in that 28 families came and settled, and then basically only married between themselves for the first 30 years probably, and then they only married out to other Volga German communities, and then probably about 1910, 1915
they didn't assimilate.
They started marrying Americans and diversity, moving to Hayes, which was the bigger town next door. 28 was doable. It was actually easy.
He's got that fast Kansas, rural Kansas internet connection, I see.
To just do all of them and record every birth, and it was to go, well, this one I want, and that one I don't want, and this one I want, and that one I don't want. It was strangely more information, but easier to digest and easier to handle.
Now, on the left here, we can actually see the founding families of Catherine. So the early founding families, we have the Bissings, Carlins, and the Coiners, which we recognize those names from the 1880 census. Then on June 24th, 1876, a second group left Katharinenstadt, Russia, for Ellis County, arriving in Hayes on July 26th and moving to Catherine the following day. Now, this includes Johannes and Agnes Carlin, Carl and Margaretha Coiner, Anna Katharina Mice. Now, all these names underneath, those are their children. Now, remember, Eugene was born in Russia, so we should find him listed here. And we certainly do. We see Johannes and Katharina Schmidt and their 2 children, Eugenius and Aloysius. But if we remember, in the 1880 census, there was Eugene and his brother John Jr. So who is Aloysius? So when we go back to Eugene's page and we look at his siblings, we see Aloysius Schmidt, born September 8th, 1874, died August 18th, 1876. Now remember, they arrived in July of 1876. So within a month of arriving, their 2-year-old son, Aloysius, died. So when we actually look at the hints, we see photos of Aloysius's grave. And these are actually typical markers in the Catherine cemetery. But when we take a look at the find a grave, we can see immigrated July 29th, 1876, as we know. And we can take a closer look at that photo.
That they have that.
Alois Schmidt, Geb, which means birth, 1874, 8th of September. And then he died 18th of August, 1876. So this must have been a really tough time for the family, because not only is moving a really stressful thing, especially imagine moving back then halfway across the world, even moving now halfway across the world. If someone from Russia were to try to move to Kansas, it's not an easy thing. And then within a month of arriving, having your son, your 2-year-old son, die, that must have been extremely difficult. Now, as I conducted my research into Mr. Beat's family, there was one family member from this side that really stood out to me. And looking back at that family tree on Ancestry, scrolling up, it's actually Johann's father, Jacob Schmidt. And so I asked Sean if he could tell me a little bit more about Jacob, who seemed to be quite a central figure in Catherine. Someone that stood out when I was looking at Mr. Beat's tree was his ancestor, Jacob Schmidt, who, I hope I say this right, was known as Der Schulmeister.
Pretty good. I would say you nailed it.
So if you could talk about him, because he seemed to be a pretty interesting character within the community.
There were apparently only six of any of the first settlers or any of the first inhabitants of Catherine, Kansas, that wrote anything. And he wrote the most. So he kept a diary for about 60 years. It was primarily his finances, but it also had any births that occurred in the family or any of their godchildren, including their godchildren in Russia. So up until the 1980s, 90s, there was nothing that came out of Russia. In fact, my grandmother said they burned all the records. There are no records. And so his book was a look back into Russia when we didn't have one, of relationships and, his godchildren and his brothers and sisters and his family tree that it was extremely rare. Now we can pretty much find all the church records. So it's a different story, but he was an important person. He was a school teacher. He was educated, godfather to a lot of children. He was an important member of the Catherine community.
An educator,
I dig this out and find this. This is the copy of Father Blaine's annotated copy of his
schoolmaster,
his family album. So
it makes sense that my ancestors that helped start this town was a schoolmaster.
The text. And then his commentary, which the commentary is very rich. It provides a lot of context and a lot of and for the interview, I reread it, and it didn't really have any stories. I mean, it didn't have stories in it. It's pretty factual.
I decided to send him the pedigree for Mr. Beat and his branch of the family in Catherine, and asked him, are there any other ancestors of Mr. Beat's that stand out to you? And then he mentioned this.
Schmidt, Salzman, Matz. Matz was another, Marian Matz was another soldier in Napoleon's army, who was captured and sent to the colonies, or chose to go to the colonies, as my Shubi ancestor was.
That was actually quite surprising to hear, and we didn't really discuss it further. Sean had mentioned his own ancestor, who was also a soldier of Napoleon, but I figured I really want to look into Marian Matz. What's going on here? Now, Marian Matz was actually Jacob Schmidt's father-in-law. Jacob Schmidt married Anna Matz, and her father was Marian. So looking back at the family tree here, when we look at Anna Matz's branch, we do see Marian Matz, and then we see her mother was Dorothy Ubert. Now, if we remember, that Ubert name was in the 1880 census as well. So it kind of comes all together, like what Sean said, where everybody really is connected. And as you go further back, you find even more connections. But looking at Marian Matz, we see that he was born in 1789 in Nancy, France, which is in Lorraine. And we see that he died in Katharinenstadt. Now, Ancestry really does not have anything other than other family trees. So I decided to dive a bit deeper into the research on Marian. Now, this ended up leading me to a page called norkarussia.info.
How did he find this?
This is about a town called Norka in Russia, which is a Volga German colony. So it was a town just like Katharinenstadt. And one of these pages discusses Napoleon's soldiers who were resettled in Volga German colonies. And we can start this story with Napoleon's invasion of Russia on June 24th, 1812. Marion was one of over 400,000 soldiers and staff who were part of this invasion into Russia. The Russians who were retreating burned everything so that the advancing army of Napoleon had few rations to find. On September 7th, there was the Battle of Borodino, which caused terrible losses on both sides. And then September 14th, Napoleon arrived in Moscow expecting to find supplies and all sorts of stuff, but instead found an almost completely empty city. And then the next morning, after arriving in Moscow, fires were starting to burn all over the place, which were set by Russian patriots. Napoleon expected the Russian army to surrender, but they never did. And he kept waiting and waiting until he finally had to try to retreat because they didn't have enough supplies to support the army. But as they tried to retreat, then they started having to deal with the Russian winter. And that's one of the things I think that's most well known about Napoleon's invasion of Russia is that things didn't go well for Napoleon because he underestimated the Russian winter. But somewhere in the chaos of Napoleon's invasion, Marion was captured. Now, Marion would be one of exactly 181 Napoleonic soldiers who were resettled in Volga German colonies. When we scroll down to the bottom, we actually see these sources are quite useful. So the first one we see here, prisoners of war of Napoleon's army in the Volga region, the arrangement, content, relationships with the local population. Bulletin of the Samara State University, and this is in Samara, Russia. So when we click this actually takes us to a page which is in Russian, but we can use our Google Translate, and then we get a really in-depth story about how the prisoners of war from Napoleon's army interacted and were treated by the local populations in these Volga German colonies. When we go back to that page, we also see down here, list of Napoleon's 181 soldiers who were resettled, and we zoom in, and this is the actual list of all 181. So when we scroll down to 110, we see Mats, Marn, Marin, Margen. So I think they couldn't quite say what it was saying, but this is Marion Mats. And we see Ekaterinenstadt. So if anyone understands Cyrillic, you're probably reading right along with me. This is number 110 right here. And all the way over on the right, these are actually quite recognizable to anyone who does genealogy because these are file locations. Now, I tried to actually get a hold of these records. I was unable to. I'm not familiar with a lot of the Russian sites. There are Russian archive websites. I tried reaching out to some of my buddies who know Cyrillic, but unfortunately no one was able to help me out. But that would be something that we could look into. And it's very possibly something that Sean McGinnis has already looked into. But speaking of Sean actually had one more really interesting thing to talk about with one of the families that actually he and Mr. Beat share, and that's the Carlin family.
The Carlins were actually Carolins, and they were from Holland. They were not German.
That's interesting about the Carlins. Can you say what's the pronunciation?
Well, as you know, doing any research, how something is spelled, people think that really means something. I really don't think it means something. It's how the priest thought it sounded like, or how somebody thought it was spelled, and the level of education of the priest or the rabbi or whoever was writing it, whatever level they were, or whether they knew the community or didn't know the community. You can get any kind of spelling you want. There is I've never found one family in any history that has a fixed spelling. It gets fixed later. It's this is it now. This is the way we spell it, and it's in America this is the way it's written. But in any historical document, so saying that is it's written from the Russian into German, or from it's written Carolin, Carolin, and they were definitely from Holland. They were from Amsterdam. From Holland is an interesting story because what I do know about them is they were all in there were two or three main departure points, and Lindheim was one of them, and the Schmidts were not far from there, maybe 15 miles from there. So they were kind of near the hub of transport for Volga Germans leaving for Russia. My guess is the Carolins or the Carlins would have gone to Germany, and from Germany gone. I mean, the centralized points for leaving were in Germany, but a lot of them were they got in their cart and drove there, and then once they were there, they were on boats. They would go up the North Sea, and they would usually winter on arrival on the coast, and then go down to the Volga from the north. The trip took about a year.
As I mentioned, I actually found Sean because he wrote a book about the founding families of Catherine, Kansas. So I asked him if he could tell me a little bit about making the book.
As we said earlier in the discussion, I started doing my family, and then I realized that they were all kind of interrelated with these other families. So I just did all of them. And then when I did all of them, I realized I had this huge file and book of information that I thought was fascinating. And I thought, why don't I make this available to other people? If you're a genealogist, you think it's interesting to everyone. Of course, genealogy is not interesting to everyone, as you can find out. But people who are not just genealogists and genealogy nerds are at a certain point interested in that. Who, you know, even if they're young, maybe not. But later you realize that people they lose their parents, and then they realize, well, I should have asked them, and I didn't. And how are we related to that family? I know we are, but how are we? And so I thought, well, if I have all this information, other people will definitely.
He makes a really good point. I think a big reason why younger people generally don't get into genealogy as much is because they just rely on the elders so much. Like, well, my mom and dad or my grandma and grandpa, they know, they have that information. It's, you know, if I ever want to find out, I always could. But then one day if they're not around and you're like, oh, I'm now the gatekeeper of this stuff, I might want to start paying attention to it. That's what I'm noticing. You notice like all of these genealogists that Jarrett has interviewed or you know, they're older than Jarrett and I.
Use this information. Why don't I publish it? Well,
yeah,
I think it took me 18 months to turn the raw information I had and data into something that you could publish. In the meantime, Russia kind of opened up and the archives opened up, and we suddenly had access to all the information in Russia, which was then a fascinating addition to 28 families moved from Katharinenstadt, Germany, Russia, to Catherine, Kansas, found a village. You can tell that, okay, this is a family in there, you know, these people have the same last name, and these are brothers and sisters, and you could see their obvious relationships when the people came over. Well, in opening up Russia and seeing the archives and the birth information and the marriage information in Russia, suddenly you realize, well, those two are cousins, and their mothers are sisters, and their grandmother. You see that these families were not inbred, but interrelated and connected, and stayed connected for the century from the time they settled in Russia till the time they moved to Kansas. There was already extensive relationship. Let me tell you an anecdotal story. Afghanistan, two guys, a guy and a woman, were there, and they talking about background, and they realized that they both had the same family name, and they looked up. They had a copy of my book, and they found out that they were related and how they related, and they were serving together in Afghanistan.
That's cool.
Now, Sean actually sent me a full digitized copy of the book, so I'll be able to share that with Mr. Beat.
Thank
He
you.
and his family will have extensive knowledge all about this side. And I really want to show a couple of pieces here because he made such interesting charts and he goes in such depth with certain things. And we even discussed that a little bit on our call.
In my book, the thing I'm probably the most proud of is the charts, which were hand done. There's no computer program that can do those. I tried to get, if I could, the family on one page. Some of them are so big you can't, and so they start on several pages. But part of the original settlers and their relationship to each other in Russia, and the central block of that information is on a page.
Wow.
And sometimes it's really dense, and I'm not even sure you could read it. But I really like the idea of having something that somebody could just print out and put on the wall. Or those charts were meant to make it visual, that you could just see, oh, look here, and then this is my, and then they're from page 20, here's the Carlines, now we'll go over to page, we'll flip over this page, oh, well, now look how they're related. Which took a lot of work trying to get it all on there, but anyway, that's something I'm most proud of.
We appreciate
thank you everybody for following along for this YouTuber family tree series, diving into the family tree of Mr. Beat. We will be coming back in a few months with the next season, which is going to be focusing on Matt Baker from Useful Charts. Well, thank you so much for checking out this video. I do hope that you enjoyed.
Very cool.
If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up.
Oh, so there I'm back. Sorry. Yeah, so that was I still have videos playing in the background. Okay. That was it. That was the entire series. And I know nothing about Volga Germans. And so that was enlightening. I didn't even know what part of Russia that was. Like I knew about the Volga River, but anyway, I'll share with the this is what I meant to share and I accidentally closed the tab. But the Volga Germans was a sizable ethnic group that 594,000 of them, and many of them did settle Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, the Dakotas, California, Washington. So yeah, there were these Volga German communities all over, mostly in the Midwest and across the Great Plains, because it resembled the land where they came from. So that last video was mostly just about how about my Volga German ancestors who founded this town in Kansas, that I will eventually visit and check out the stuff. Myself and Jeannie Blogger is here. Hey there.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for sticking around. It was a bit longer here, but
it was very weird seeing myself all sped up. So I hope it's not too disorienting to people like seeing me talk regularly, because I'm sure
why are you
it seems like I'm
so
talking
slowly?
really slow. I don't really talk that fast.
They probably didn't even notice. Yeah, no, a lot of good information there. I guess the title is mostly accurate because a lot of that stuff that we were told is just not true, or it's either, I don't know. And do you think it's because of the fact that so much is just passed down, verbally? It's not written down until so much stuff that hasn't been written down until the last 50 years, really.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think sometimes in families, especially in certain eras or certain areas, certain myths will kind of be, seen as kind of exotic or cool. So some people might just kind of make up stories sometimes, especially if they don't really know anything. But another thing that also happens, I like to call the telephone game of history. So basically, there is the true story, and then that person tells it to their kids, and then they tell it to their kids, and then it gets passed down each generation. But just like that game of telephone where you whisper into someone's ear next to you, and then they whisper into the person's ear next to them, and it goes in a circle, and by the end it's not what you said. It's kind of the same thing with stories, where someone gets something wrong or someone changes something to maybe make it seem a bit more crazy, or just add a bit to it, and then over time you have these stories. But stuff like, I think, like the Native American ancestor myth, I think a lot of it is just because of that sort of, people kind of find that to be exotic in a sense. And so I think there's just been a lot of different times where it's kind of popped up where people are like, oh yeah, I have Native American ancestry. There are
That's
some
cool.
families where it's possible that they do, and they just can't prove it.
So like, that was one of my other questions, is like, and that where the gap where her name wasn't on the marriage license, that what the heck is that about?
I tried to figure that out. I couldn't. I really wanted to put it in there just kind of to talk a little bit about, we can't always figure it out, and things aren't always so straightforward. There were a lot of people in the comments of that video who kind of made their own guesses. Some people said, maybe that it just didn't happen that day. So it was set up, then it just didn't happen. I can't remember what some of the other ones were, but we just don't know. I wonder if there's like a family story somewhere that maybe would explain it, but
there's so much that we just will never know, because you think about all these official records, like I always think about stuff like records lost, like that last guy from Catherine that wrote the book there, like he was talking about all the records that were lost in Russia, and then all of a sudden, boom, you had them. But even when you had them, like, it didn't necessarily, like, it just verified things. And I just feel like there's still a lot missing from, who was the guy from New England, from Boston? What was his name again?
David Lambert.
Oh, David. Yeah. That guy, man, you can tell he's passionate.
Oh yeah, very passionate.
I appreciated how he, like, he's like, you get a little taste of their personality by these court records. Like that's the closest we can get sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and you really lucked out with the Whitcombs being so well researched, because there's been a lot done on them. But there's also they're one of those families that a lot of people are able to trace back to, just because they had so many kids who then had so many kids, and
Yeah.
there's thousands of descendants.
Well, are you worried about like? I didn't watch the entire series that you did with Sam, and are
Yeah.
you? I don't know. I think you found quite a bit of information about him because his records are pretty good, right?
His were decent. Sam comes from an Ashkenazi Jewish family,
Mm-hmm.
which I have a lot of experience with, because I'm also mostly Ashkenazi Jewish, partly Sephardi Jewish. And with Ashkenazi Jews, the documentation is really limited. So usually getting back to early 19th century is very difficult. So I think there was one of his lines where we were able to trace it back to an ancestor who was born in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise it's very difficult. You're really with the research into Sam's tree, it was really trying really stretching every little bit we could, because some of it was literally finding a transcribed list of an index, which was then put online in like a paragraph form. So basically someone read a transcription of an index and then
Yeah.
so there was all these possible errors that could happen within there. And then it was just a matter of, well, this name could match his family's name and they were in this town, so that seems most likely. It's not kind of like with your family where we have multiple records where we can correlate it, and then we have their siblings who have records who also correlate that same information. So like, even though we didn't have Mary Galtree on the marriage record, all of their children had tons of records
Yeah.
saying Mary Galtree, plus we had the DNA matching, so it was
Yeah.
no qualms about whether or not that's true.
I just wonder how that got started. But I guess what I was going to ask was, are you worried about like this next series with Matt from Useful Charts? Do you think that what if you don't find anything at all? Like I know the Whitcomb connection, that's going to help a lot, but what if there's somebody you just don't find anything like later on down the road?
Yeah, I mean that is something that's a bit of a worry in my mind. And actually, it was funny. My mom had asked me before I hopped on this. She goes, "Did you know that Mr. Beat had such amazing stories in his family tree?" And my answer was, well, most of us do have these amazing stories. It's just a matter of, do we have the documentation to actually find them? Because I mean, if
Yeah.
you really think about it, we have a lot of ancestors. They all lived in history, obviously. History is
Yeah.
interesting, especially, what happens, what they did. And so really everyone kind of has that interesting story, but being able to actually find it and confirm that it actually is true, that's a difficult thing. So
Yeah.
for Matt Baker's stuff, I've looked into it already, and I have found some good stories outside of just the Whitcombs. We will be diving more into that though. But there are some other good stories. And then I'm also going to be working a little bit on his wife's tree as well.
Okay.
So she'll be a part of it. She's actually a genealogist herself, a really good genealogist who
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, she has a blog, and it includes some genealogy stuff. It talks about a lot of other stuff as well. But so I'm going to try to dive into her tree, which I think is going to be a bit harder because she's a good genealogist, which means I basically have to try to find any little place where she didn't, search already. So, and
Then
she's
Matt's
been at
going to
it
turn
for
it all into a
years.
chart when you're all done, isn't he?
Yeah. So, yeah. In fact, I had connected with vlogging through history,
Oh,
and I
cool.
didn't even ask to do his tree because he's a professional genealogist,
Oh, I
and
didn't know that.
he's been at it for decades. So it kind of like trying to research his tree. Oh my gosh, I'd be up against such a difficult task because when he's already done all these little, searching for every little bit you can, I'm literally searching for the breadcrumbs. So,
Yeah.
it'd be difficult. But I do have some other seasons lined up, which I guess this would be a good place to kind of announce it in a way.
Yeah.
So next season is going to be Matt Baker from Useful Charts, and then a little bit on his wife. The season after that is actually going to be on Cypher from Cynical Historian.
Oh, cool.
So we're going to be diving into his family tree. And then for season 5, we are actually going to be going into Steve Heimler's tree from Heimler's History.
Oh, awesome.
So that's what we
Great.
have lined up for now. I'm trying to line up more seasons. My hope is with this is to get all sorts of backgrounds. So right now it's kind of European heavy, but unfortunately all the people that have agreed, well, not unfortunately, but all the people that have agreed so far all are, coming from European backgrounds. So I'm hoping to kind of bring in more, people with African ancestry, people with Asian ancestry, people with, maybe some sort of like Middle Eastern ancestry, South American, Native American, basically any sort. I mean, there's so many amazing ancestries all around the world. And if you follow along on my reactions with all the different DNA reactions I do, I mean, Cape Verde, Japan, Korea, Singapore, there was Brazil, there's like all the, there's small places like, Cuba, Dominican Republic, all these small islands. And I mean, there's just so many ancestries in the world, so many ancestral stories. It's quite amazing. So I hope I can touch on a lot of different stuff.
Yeah, well, I feel like I'm more American than I realized. I know that sounds weird to say, but like, I have deep roots apparently in this country. And just the fact that, I mean, I before you approached me about this, and I said it when I did my own DNA test that I revealed what was that, 3 years ago now. And I never really got into my own genealogy that much, but you've got me more interested. And part of that's just me being self-centered, right? I want to know more about myself, but it's my family has been truly appreciative, and many of my family haven't seen these videos yet. So some of them are tuning in tonight, but it's like I can't wait for, Christmas and sharing all this. Like they're like, hey, there's an entire video series now about us. And it's just, it makes you, I understand nationalism a little bit more now at this point. I'm a very anti-nationalist person, if anyone's watched but yeah, I get where it comes from, this pride in your heritage.
I think there is somewhat of a selfishness in genealogy in a sense, because it really is like, let me learn more about me. But it also is kind of, it's an interesting way to look at history. So like for me, I definitely started out with just that general interest of like, well, where did I come from?
Right.
I know my parents' parents, and I knew some of their parents, but who were their parents, and so on. And eventually, once you kind of dig out all these stories, I would be hanging out with some of my friends, and I'd just kind of start talking about genealogy. And next thing I know, I'd be on the computer building their family trees, and it would be just as interesting, because it's like, oh man, my friend that I've been hanging out with for years comes from this amazing ancestry. And we just found his great grandfather's, Civil War records, or we found these amazing records. And there was a friend of mine I knew who, he had these like weird shaped pinkies, and then like he used to call them crooked pinkies. And then we found his great grandfather's World War I draft, and on it says, are there any deformities? And it says crooked pinkies. And so he was like, oh my gosh, it's genetic. So, you can really dig out all these crazy, amazing things.
Schmidt,
and so
Thomas Schmidt, is that his name? The schoolmaster.
The schoolmaster was Jacob Schmidt. Jacob
Schmidt.
Schulmeister Schmidt.
Okay. I feel like I'd get along really well with that dude.
Yeah. Well, he's the one, if once you are able to make it out to Catherine, the Ellis County Historical Society has a ton of stuff on him.
Okay.
And of those model houses, I'm pretty sure they have his house. And then
Nice.
his son Johannes's house, who's his son who you're related through. So
Right.
Eugene's father.
Okay.
So yeah, and they were
Eugene's father.
a massive family. They take up a multiple pages in the book that Sean McGinnis wrote.
All these random facts by this person here. Yeah, no, Chad, if you have any other questions, I feel like I'm almost like overwhelmed from all this information because it's all new to me. Brand new. Need to kind of, let it simmer. But I will be having lots of conversations with my extended family over the coming months, and yeah, looking forward to sharing all this with them.
I do have some questions for you though.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so one that I'm curious about of everything that you learned tonight, what would you say? I'll give you the top 2 things that you've learned that you would consider like the most surprising / interesting.
Easily the flag. Like the first American flag ever flown there's a good chance that it was flown on the property of my ancestors, like some of my ancestors. That's pretty cool. And the other thing I think is the connection with Eisenhower and how you found additional like documentation to like back it up, and like, it's I guess the maybe tied for that is Edgar Whitcomb. I keep saying that name weird. Whitcomb. Yeah. Just because, like the more I learned about him, the more like another guy I probably would have got along with, although he didn't die that long ago. I was alive when he was alive. It's like, it's kind of crazy to think about these connections that a lot of us have that we don't realize. And even I think about this all the time now, ever since this, is like how many of like your friends that you think you're not related to, you actually are, like, and you wonder like maybe that's why we get along so well. But I think about there's a lot of your family you don't get along with well at all, like you're opposites of. And so like when you find an ancestor you're like that you connect with, it's almost like this is your like way to bring them back to life, where like you can feel like I don't know, I'm starting to sound weird now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No,
what about you? What was the coolest thing you found out through this whole process?
Gosh, I think the thing for me that I really enjoyed the most that kind of was unexpected was finding Marion Matz was a soldier in Napoleon's army.
Oh yeah, that threw me off. I'm like,
resettled, and then like of only 181, and then we have the full list, like all 181.
Yeah. I was so weird. I was talking to somebody about Napoleon today. In fact, the Russian campaign. Just today, I was talking to somebody about that, and then that came out like, what?
Yeah. Now you can say your ancestor was literally there. He was part of the invasion. So, I'd gotten in touch with the person who ran that Norco website, and they said they didn't really have much else, and they were a little shy to be on any sort of Zoom call or anything. Mm-hmm. But they did mention they said that it wasn't certain if they were captured in a battle or if they had defected, which is highly possible being how bad conditions were.
Right.
But they also said how one thing is that it really kind of was unusual for soldiers, Napoleonic soldiers during that campaign to be actually captured. So it's really kind of an interesting story just all around. And to think of the storyline of how that family within 2 generations goes from France to Russia and then to America after marrying into the German family that was close to the Netherlands.
Yeah, that threw me off. I was like, I thought they had roots in France or like Western Germany, and then all of a sudden they're in Russia. What? Yeah, the Russian thing always threw me off. My grandpa always told me, he's like, there's a Prussian connection, But they skipped right. That's not Prussia. That's
no,
further
it's
east.
Russia. Yeah, it's Russia. So
I don't know where the Prussian connection is. I don't know where that came from. Like, I don't think I have any ancestors from Prussia. I was always told that you know.
Yeah, it might have just been also kind of, you know, the way that country lines have changed and all of that. That sometimes people just refer to certain things in a certain way, even if it isn't that. Like a lot of documents for people, you know, we'll know people come from like some place in Romania, and then it'll say, you know, Russia or Prussia sometimes, you know, or it's Austria-Hungary sometimes.
The fluid back then, yeah.
But yeah, so I do see someone keeps asking, are we related? And yes, we are related.
Oh yeah, we went over this last time, right? What was our connection again?
It's distant. I'm gonna pull it up right now.
Also, George Washington wanted to know if you were related to an actor from a James Bond movie.
Yes, my first cousin once removed was a Bond girl during one of the Sean Connery movies.
Oh, that's cool.
So
my uncle works on Hollywood movies, so that's fun.
Okay, yeah, I won't say who it is, but I will say that she was also a ginger. So there you go. She worked with Sean Connery, and she's a ginger and a Bond girl. There you go. So we are 19th cousins 3 times removed.
19th cousins 3 times removed. Not
and
bad.
That's through John of Gaunt.
John of Gaunt. That's way back. That's what, 1500s, 1300s.
Yeah. Actually, let me see. I don't even remember.
Yeah. That.
1340 he was born.
Okay.
So 14th century.
Yeah, I hope you get some no offense to Europeans, but it'd be interesting to see like branches from other parts of the world, like just because it's just so interesting.
Yeah, it really, especially with American families, sometimes you just really never know where you're gonna find it takes you.
I'm more boring than I thought, honestly. Like it's just, you know, and I think that's part of the Native American thing. Back to that, like a lot of us want to be more exotic, you know, because it makes us more interesting with that mixed heritage. But you know, whatever. It's a pretty interesting heritage, I gotta say, and I thank you for all your work.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So the funny thing is, this is probably only like a small snippet of everything, because I'm sure you saw when we were kind of scrolling through the genie tree. I think you even said you're like, wow, that's a lot of names. The tree is huge. And I mean, there were a lot of stories I didn't even touch on, like the beat side. That was one of the things that was on my list of what do I want to choose to look into. And I ended up deciding the Volga German story was a bit more interesting. Plus I found a bit more, but like the beat side, it traced to France, but it traced to Alsace-Lorraine, which was an area that like went back and forth. So they actually considered themselves ethnic Germans, but the name was originally written like Bithe. And then you have there's your Creighton ancestor, who is your Irish ancestor on I think she was on your dad's side. So you know you have that little bit of Irish kind of hiding in there, which Ireland is very difficult to dive into. A lot of
I was always wondering about the British Isles part. I was like, what is that? And I guess the Alsace-Lorraine is we seem to have better records on that anyway. Like on my grandma's side, I don't think I gave you all of them, maybe because I think
you sent me a couple of emails. I know, so
I have been getting emails like DNA updates. I don't know if that has anything to do with your work, but because if you've been filling in some gaps, and so I don't know, like you reminder to send me all the family tree stuff.
Part of it's I put the DNA on the other databases just to expand the matches we were able to get.
Okay.
So even though I limited myself in the first 3 episodes to just the family tree DNA and GED match, I kind of signed up for the other ones. So once I was in there, see if I could kind of use that to tell the story. But your tree was already so well traced out. It was like, I don't even need the DNA to help flesh anything out. It's already all there. So I think a lot of that is like, genetic match updates, because I get those too.
Okay.
Because I signed myself up for the, notifications for that. I see.
Do you want to answer this question real quick? Because
one twice removed me, and it's funny. I actually made a meme for this recently because sometimes it's so simple, it's hard to explain. One way to think about it is, so like for your first cousins, that means that one of your parents is your first cousin's aunt or uncle. So one of your parents and your first cousin's parents are siblings. Well, your first cousin's children are your first cousins once removed, because they're your first cousins and then they're one generation removed. So that's what once removed means. So every generation of a difference is the remove. So like your first cousin's grandkids are your first cousins twice removed.
Vsauce has it might be on one of his other channels, but Michael from Vsauce has a good video that's where I finally understood it. Like does this diagram and he draws it out.
Yeah.
I don't remember the name of it, but
there's actually a very, very small contingency within the genealogy community that wants to update it, because removed doesn't specify if it's going up a generation or down. So like, you have your aunt and, but you're her nephew, it's not like, but whereas like your first cousin once removed also calls you a first cousin once removed. So your first cousins once removed are your first cousin's children, and they're also your parents' first cousins. That's one of the parts that makes it confusing. So there's this small contingency that wants to change it. So there's like first cousins once removed up and first cousins once removed down. But then people are like, no, it's already too confusing. So,
more words. That's tough.
But, just a little fun fact in the genealogy community. So.
All right. Well, we're gonna wrap this up because it's getting late, especially in North Carolina where you're at. And so, thanks for joining us, and thank you for watching. And also, most importantly, thank you so much for doing all this research and even interviewing people, finding people, and reaching out to them. That's just above and beyond. So, thank you so much, Jarrett, for all that you've done with this series.
Thanks. My pleasure. My pleasure. And I know that all the people that were involved with it, all the other genealogists that either supplied information or did Zoom calls with me, they were all really happy to be a part of it. And I think it's actually a good thing that just a quick to say that when you really need to do in-depth genealogy, collaboration really is key to it. So to be able to do this amazing stuff, it really is well beyond just being me. I need to, I need a team of people of expertise, and that's what really draws it out. So,
thank you to all of them. Genealogists are I think I just appreciate the work you do even more after all this, because historians, a lot of times they're looking for the wrong things. We need more genealogists, I think, in the world. So anyway, all right. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.